It's the afternoon of Monday, March the 16th, 2009. We are in Far Hills, New Jersey, in the office of former Governor Kean. We're here for the Rutgers program on the governor, the Thomas H. Kean Archive. I'm Michael Aron from NJN News. We began a series of discussions with people who served under Governor Kean in January of this year. And today we are going to begin what is likely to be a series of discussions with Governor Kean himself.
For a McDonald, they all came. But when I was elected governor, the Irish Tourist Board came and all their research and said, "You're Irish." I said, "Why do you say I'm Irish?" And they said, because if it's K-E-A-N pronounced Kean, that's Irish. The Scotch will pronounce it Kean. But there are a bunch of counties in Ireland where the EA is always A. That's why you get Ronald Reagan, that's why you get McCain's, that's why you get a bunch of people who are spelled with the EA but always pronounced A.
Kean, the lobbyist?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was very Irish.
Yes.
His whole family was very Irish.
Yeah. Well,
but he was a Kean.
Yeah,
Did you
yeah.
ever talk to him about the family?
Tom Kean?
Kean.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, we're both from Livingston.
Yeah, I know, but why their family went to Kean and yours stayed with Kean?
The only thing I heard is one time from a professor of Gaelic years ago. Actually, it was at Drew, long before I was at Drew, but when I was in the assembly. And I ran into him, and he said, "You know why you're Kean and Kean and other people are Kean, and why the spelling is K-E-A-N-E, C-A-N-E, whatever?" He said, "Because of the dirty British." He said, because they were, he said, when they were chasing the Irish and the Scotch back and forth from Ireland and Scotland, what they were trying to do was tax them. And they didn't have any written language, really. And they were sheep herders and all that kind of things. And the only way they could tax them was to get them have names. So they all had names but not a written language. So a lot of them were called Kean, or Kean or whatever, and they tried to get them to write it down. And they all wrote it down differently because they didn't have any written language. It was profit. So according to this guy, he said they all spelled it differently and wrote it down. It became the family name, because that's what went in the British tax rolls. But I don't know. It's good an explanation of. Now we've got cousins, actually, who are called McCain.
McCain.
M-C-K-E-A-N. Nobody ever calls it McCain. It's always McCain. So anyway, my father didn't want the university named after us because of that problem. He said, "I'm going to call it Kean."
Some do.
I know.
Governor, we have an 80-minute tape.
Okay.
But if you want to take a break at any time, just say so.
Okay.
We're not editing this thing at all. It'll just be up on the internet.
Well, I dressed up in a coat and tie for you, so
If it
look
gets
good on the
warm,
internet.
and if it gets warm and you feel like taking the jacket
Okay.
off,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay.
Governor, there are many places we could begin this set of interviews, but we've decided to begin by asking you to think back to your childhood a bit. And you came from a family that had been in public service in this country for a couple of 100 years. Did you feel pressure to continue in that tradition?
No. In fact, it's the last thing I wanted to do. I had no interest in it whatsoever. I had interest in it because my father was in it and in Congress. I sort of followed it, but I followed it like you follow a baseball team. I mean, I knew the players and the scores. I knew we were supposed to root for Republicans and not Democrats, so I didn't always follow that policy. And but that was about it. And I was interested in being a teacher. That's all I ever wanted to be. School on. And I never even conceived of myself. If I had talent, so I would have gone another direction. If I had talent, I would have been a shortstop. If I had talent, I would have been an opera singer. But those things were ruled out for me. so teaching was what I wanted to do.
So you became a teacher.
Yeah.
Out of you went to Princeton, and then
Princeton, went in the Army for a while, and actually I'm the only governor, I think it was in the New Jersey National Guard, because I did my reserve work there. In fact, my commander of the National Guard used to look at me, you know, you're the commander-in-chief when you're governor. He looked at me and say, you know, I left the Guard as a specialist, first class or third class or something, and he said, you got promoted awful fast. But, yeah, I was in the Army, and then went to Wall Street, and went from Wall Street to teaching.
Where?
St. Mark's School, where I'd gone. And
Which is where?
It's in Southborough, Massachusetts. The head of the history department dropped dead of a heart attack, and the headmaster of the school, I'd been working for years at a camp for underprivileged kids in New Hampshire, and he'd been up there, seen the place, and talked to me late one evening, and he said, what do you want to do? I said, I always wanted to teach. And he said, well, that's great, you know. So I didn't think about it anymore. And then he called up and said, the head of the history department dropped dead yesterday. You majored in history at Princeton. You all of that. Would you be willing to come? And I said, when? He said, next week. And so I walked into the head of the firm and said I resign.
You were living where at the time?
Living in New York City.
Were you married?
No. No, that was easy. You're not married, you can move. I wasn't married, so I got in the car and got what belongings I had and drove up there and had a princely salary of $3,400 a year. But you didn't require any money because they gave you your board. So I had my apartment and my food. Out of the $3,400, I had some left over for summer travel.
How long did you do that?
I did it for I came in the middle of the year. And then I did it for 2 years after that. And I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And got in fact, some of the kids I taught have become my best friends. One of them, I think, was an usher in my wedding, and because we were close enough of an age. And I took a lot of them up to work at the camp, or the camp for underprivileged kids that I worked at, and we became very close friends. And the last year I taught there, they dedicated a yearbook to me, and I was advisor to the student government, advisor to the senior class, and coached 3 sports, and ran a dormitory, and started about 3 clubs, and was advisor to the student newspaper, and all of that. And because a bachelor, you can work 24 hours a day. It's not a problem. And I loved it, but I kept looking around at the faculty, and there were very, very good teachers there. But they couldn't go anywhere else because they didn't have their certification, teach in public schools. A lot of them didn't have MAs or PhDs. So if they wanted to leave, the only place they could go was other non-public schools. So they go to parochial schools, they go to private schools, but they couldn't go into a public school. They couldn't go into a college or a junior college. And I thought, if I'm going to go into this profession, I want to be able to move around. I want to be able to teach where I want to teach and have opportunities where I want to take them. And so I dragged myself out of there. It was the toughest thing I've ever done is to go into that headmaster and say I was going to leave.
Really?
Yeah, the toughest job I've ever left because I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Loved the kids, loved the teaching, loved the classroom, loved the coaching, loved all of it. But I knew that if I didn't go then, I probably wouldn't go. And I was going to look like some of those guys who'd been there 25 years and at that point couldn't go anywhere.
Well, I want to ask you where you went to, but before I do that, why do you think a young man like yourself was so drawn to teaching?
I loved it because partly when I had a lot of problems when I was younger. I stuttered badly. I was dyslexic. Had it not been for some teachers, I'm not sure I would have made it. At least not made it well. And they took time with me that way beyond whatever a teacher was paid to do. And they'd see me after class, and they'd ask me to stay, and they'd work on me and work with things I was having difficulty with, and recognize some of them. Dyslexia hadn't been invented at that point. Nobody knew the term. But they recognized that I was reversing numbers and letters, that terrible problem with spelling and languages and those kind of things, and I needed a lot of help to get through those subjects. And they're willing to give me that help and understand that I wasn't just dumb, which is what they called you in those days. If you couldn't do You know, other teachers called me dumb. You know, why are you so dumb, basically?
These were teachers at St. Mark's?
Yeah. And before.
How long were you at St. Mark's?
6 years.
6 years.
Yeah, I went there as a 12-year-old and stayed there till graduation. And before that, I was at school in Washington. My father didn't like the Washington schools much, which is why I ended up going away at the age of 12.
Had he gone to
Yes, he had.
St. Mark's?
Yes, he had.
Is that one of the reasons you wanted to go there?
I didn't want to go there at all. I was told I was going there. In those days, they didn't ask the kids. At least not me. I was told where I was going. I went kicking and screaming. Didn't like it when I went there. Didn't like it after I got there. Didn't much like it all the way through. But you went where you stayed.
So, up until age 12, you were in the Washington public schools or in a private school?
Private schools.
Private
Schools, yeah. Yeah.
And you, how many brothers and sisters did you have?
5.
And you were number 5, I believe.
I was number 5 out of 6. Yeah.
You majored in history at Princeton.
Yes.
You taught history at St. Mark's.
Yes.
American history? World history?
I taught both. I taught early European history. And early European history in school is defined as starting with the basically Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and going through till probably the Renaissance, or going through the Renaissance. And then I taught American history. I got great course. I taught honors history because I took over the courses of the department chairman, which a new teacher would never have been able to do.
Do you think you were drawn to history in part because your family had played a part in American history?
No, I loved the stories. I really loved, I mean, to me, people don't teach history very well normally because they teach a bunch of facts, and dates, and gender studies and all that kind of thing. What's fun about history to me is the fact these are people, and the decisions they made a difference. And you can look at a leader or a king or sometimes quite ordinary people who made decisions that changed the history of the world. And looking at those people and why they made those decisions, the stories of their lives, was always fascinating to me. And that's the part I loved. I didn't, you know, I could go without the dates and the names and the economic history and that kind of thing. But I loved the stories of people and what they did, what they were like.
If you have that kind of an understanding of history, you probably soon arrive at the idea that one man can have an idea, and if it's a good idea or a bad idea, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's not only ideas, but there's some historians who looked at the history of leaders' health, and you know what kind of decisions did it mean. Silly example, not silly example, really, Napoleon had to leave the field of Waterloo because he had intestinal problems, basically diarrhea. And he had to leave the field a number of times during that battle. And there are some historians who would tell you that had he not drunk or eaten whatever he'd eaten a couple of days before, that maybe Napoleon would have won that battle. Who knows? But I mean, that kind of thing to me is fascinating, and kids find it fascinating when you teach it.
What is your family's history within the history of this country? How far back does it go? How many members of Congress were there?
Oh, I don't know. It's let me think. There were John Kean was a member of the Continental Congress. Was captured by the British and spent most of the war on a British ship in Philadelphia Harbor. And then he was, after he got out, he was the first cashier of the First National Bank, appointed by Washington and supervised by Hamilton. And then died because he got some sort of a lung disease or something from his long imprisonment, dampness, I guess, in a boat. And his widow moved to Elizabeth, and the family was there ever since. basically.
How many generations above you, behind you, would he be? Can you figure that out?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I had to get a piece of paper and think, and you don't want to wait.
Yeah.
But it was the interesting people. His widow married a guy called Nimsewicz, who was the poet laureate of Poland, and was Kosciuszko's second in command when they tried to throw the Russians out. So he's very much part of the age of the democratic revolutions. He came over here and wrote and because he was a writer and a poet, wrote descriptions of what the country was like at that point, including the description that they used when they reconstructed Mount Vernon. It was because he went and stayed with Washington. It was by far the best description that was written at the time. And so I wrote my senior thesis at Princeton on his descriptions and what he wrote when he traveled in this country. And when he went back to Europe.
What period now are we?
We're talking just after the Revolution. We're talking from the Revolution till about, I guess he lived almost till 1840, I think, and he lived to be an old man. But he was at Napoleon's coronation. Described that. He was at.
How do you spell his name?
Nimcewicz. It's one of the few things I can spell, because I wrote on it.
How do you say it again?
Nimsewicz.
Nimsewicz.
Yeah.
And you wrote your senior thesis on him.
Yeah, I'll tell you, if you run into some people who were real Polish, I mean, when I ran for governor, that connection didn't hurt. That I had ancestors who was that prominent on the Polish side.
So John Kean's widow moved to Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And then met Nimsewicz, or
yeah.
with Nimsewicz?
No, met Nimsewicz there.
So why did she pick Elizabeth? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, her family, she was a Livingston. And the house that she eventually bought to live in had been Governor Livingston's house, and the first governor of New Jersey. And that's still there and has a great history, and you can go there. Now it's open to the public. And you find everything from Hessian hacks and the banisters when the soldiers tried to catch the governor to all sorts of people were there. Martha Washington stopped there at one point on the way to John Jay, got married there. William Henry Harrison eloped out one of the windows. I mean, it's a great house to go to, and interesting history.
The Livingston house, is that?
Yeah, it's called Liberty Hall.
Liberty Hall.
And it was our family's house. I mean, the family was there ever since this woman moved there. The family never left.
Is it on the campus of Kean University?
It is now. It is now. Yes, it was when my aunt died. My first cousins. My aunt had put a tremendous amount of work into it. Had gotten all the old furniture out of the barn and put it back in the house, and there were trunks and trunks and trunks of old papers, including letters by the founding fathers. And because the family's always been pack racks, pat racks. You look around his office, you find, I don't throw away much. And now the day, and so we've got all these things which Kean University is now going through, and they found some interesting treasures of letters from people who've made history.
So, John Kean was married to a Livingston.
He married a Livingston.
Was she the daughter of the first?
Niece.
The niece.
Niece of the first governor.
Of the first governor
yes.
of New Jersey.
Yeah.
So this is how the Keans and the Livingstons
yes.
came together.
Yes.
And the town of Livingston, New Jersey, is named after the first governor.
I believe so. Yeah.
And you grew up around that town, or in that town?
In that town. In that town. When we went in Washington, my father, in those days when my father served in Congress, the family went with the congressman. There's not now where they worked only 3 or 4 days a week. They'd work 6 days a week down there then, and so the family moved down. So I spent a lot of my youth in Washington.
How many other Keans have there been in Congress since then?
Oh, John Kean was a senator. Hamilton Fish wasn't in Congress, but he was a director senator. He was Secretary of State.
John Kean, of what era?
Oh, end of the late 1800s, and then Hamilton Fish Kean was a senator. In fact, there's a picture in the office here of him addressing a rally in Patterson with Herbert Hoover, who was, I guess, running for election at that point, which is why he lost. My grandfather lost. Running with Herbert Hoover was not easy.
And then your father, of course.
Yeah.
You say that you left St. Mark's after 2 years and
it was teaching, yes,
teaching,
2.5 years, yes.
And that it was one of the most difficult separations of your life. What did you go to?
Well, I love working with kids. I mean, I loved the most formative thing I ever did in my life was probably working at that camp in New Hampshire. I mean, that probably changed my life as much as anything ever did. And the teaching was sort of an extension of that. I went to Teachers College, Columbia. The best place I could think to learn how to be a teacher.
Is that a 2-year program or a 1-year program?
Well, I went there 1 year, 1 year and a half, or 2 years, depending how long you take to get your. Because I wanted not only to get my certification, I wanted to get my MA, and I started working on a PhD, and did a lot of work for the PhD.
So, how did you end up in the New Jersey Assembly?
Well, I was not teaching, but I was studying for that, and I'd done all the work except the dissertation. I had to do the dissertation, but I've been working summer and winter. I'd taken courses in the summertime, so I got all that done in about 2 years, which means you really work at it. And before I went into the dissertation, which is a year's work, that's writing a book, I want to take some time off. I had a professor at Princeton who told me that the most exciting thing he ever did was work at a convention for a candidate who didn't have a chance. Because if you work for a candidate who's favored, he's surrounded by senators and governors and county chairmen and all the rest of the political establishment. If you work for a candidate who doesn't have a chance, none of those people show up. And so if you show up, you have to be right next to the candidate. And in the professor's case, he'd worked for Averell Harriman, who was a candidate who was prominent but didn't have a chance at the convention. And in my case, I worked for Bill Scranton, who had been governor of Pennsylvania, who I knew about and admired very much. I thought he was the best governor in the country at the time. And I thought he'd make a great president, but he didn't have a chance because he was running against Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater, who were the two.
This was 64?
60, no, this was...
Nixon ran in 60. Goldwater won the nomination in 64.
Yeah, well, you're right. It was Goldwater. It was Goldwater, yeah. And so what happened was that nobody else was volunteering. In fact, they couldn't find anything for me to do. There was one fella, wonderful man called Warren Sinsheimer, who had volunteered as a lawyer in New York. He's the only one we could find out in either New York or New Jersey who was working for Scranton. So I got hold of him and said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm Northeast chairman because there's nobody else. And why don't you go try to stir up something in New Jersey?" So I opened up a little office in Union County, Scranton for president. Got a couple of people, volunteers, all volunteer, and tried to stir up some things. And I think Webb Todd, who was the state chairman, who was Christy Whitman's father, thought I was a little bit of a nuisance, but he tolerated me. And then I was working in the headquarters and got a call from this fellow Sinsheimer. He said, "Can you pay your own way to San Francisco where the convention is?" And I said, "Yes," figuring I could get it from my father. And he said, "You're now our National Youth Chairman."
How old were you in 1964?
Oh, I must have been about 22, I guess. And so I, 23 maybe, but I got in a plane, went out there. And what happened was, Rockefeller had a fire at the governor's mansion in Albany. And evidently, Governor Rockefeller came out of one entrance on one side, I guess a long building. Wife came out way on the other side. And to the reporters' minds, that confirmed rumors that they were going different directions. And in those days, if you were divorced, it really disqualified you. the president. And particularly if you've gone through a divorce during the campaign, which he was about to go through one. So what happened is he didn't like Goldwater at all. And being a Rockefeller, he had paid for everything right through the convention, which means he had the best hotel in San Francisco, he had the best staff, best political consultants, and he turned them all over to us, who didn't have anything, no money, no consultant, nothing, because he didn't like Goldwater. And we didn't have a chance of winning, but he just wanted to, you know, have the other side represented. So I was turned over, all of a sudden this whole staff got turned over to me for political professionals. And I didn't know anything, and they did, but they reported to me. And I had a big office of my own, San Francisco. We had a headquarters, the best hotel in San Francisco. I was the one detailed to, you know, get a group to meet Eisenhower when he came in to greet the convention. I was in charge of the convention demonstration for Bill Scranton. So I mean, I had enormous responsibility and an enormous amount of fun doing it, even though we didn't have a chance of winning. It was a lot of fun, and I got to know these political professionals very well. It taught me a lot.
Who?
It was the first consulting firm in the country. I don't remember the name now. But they later one of them later went on to be one of Reagan's top people, or top advisors. No, John Dierdorf later on. He was with me later on. No, I'm trying to remember. He was before Dierdorf. This was the first political, because California is always ahead of the country and everything. These were the first political consultants, really, and they knew amazing things. I mean, when I had to meet, I had to organize a group to meet Scranton at the airport, and we didn't know how to get a bunch of people to get to the airport. We had to show activity. So he said, "This is how you do it." I said, "Go to the airport, and then have the announcer announce, all television and media people greeting Governor Scranton, please report to Gate 6. So as soon as people hear television and media coming, they'll come to Gate 6 if they're waiting for planes. And so we had, 300 or 400 people come to Gate 6. We had people said Scranton greeted the airport by crowd. And the same thing in San Francisco. We sent, we didn't know how to get a crowd because of the political people were all for him. Goldwater had a huge crowd meeting when he came into San Francisco. We didn't have any support in California, really. But how do you get a crowd? Well, we had little sort of Tiffany kind of invitations engraved saying, would you please come to a small reception to greet Governor Scranton on his arrival in San Francisco at the hotel. We sent it to every registered Republican in town. So we got to the hotel. I got to the hotel with Scranton, and there was a mob scene outside of these little ladies. But I've got an invitation. And the headline in the paper next day was, "Mob greets Scranton, enthusiastic reception." So I mean, those kind of tricks, really, but things that little things that were fun.
You make politics sound a little like marketing.
Well, it is. Some of it is. It's always been a big part of it. But it was, putting a demonstration together when the Goldwater people didn't want our people on the floor and so on. It was challenging and interesting, and I had we had all the young people with us from Stanford and from Berkeley and all of that. So it was.
Was it a two-man convention, Goldwater versus Scranton?
Yeah. Yeah, but Scranton didn't have any support, really, because it was too late. We had, in fact, the New Jersey delegation, I'm so mad at them, the New Jersey delegation decided that in order not to create any trouble, they'd split the votes. It was a Scranton delegation, but they figured since Scranton didn't have a chance, they didn't want to annoy Goldwater, so they give 50% of the votes to Goldwater, 50%, typical New Jersey. Don't take a stand.
So, are you telling us that you were bitten by a bug there? And
yeah, I got absolutely enthralled by it and went home and called Webb Todd, who was our state chairman, Christie's father, and said, I want to help. What should I do? So I went down and...
help what? Help get elected? Help Goldwater get elected?
No. I didn't want to help Goldwater get elected at the time. I mean, I had no problem with Goldwater, but I wasn't enthusiastic about him at the time. I worked for Scranton at the convention. No, I just wanted to help the Republican Party in the state. Because everybody told me, it's local. You may want to get all excited about national politics, but it's not what's happening. It happens locally. You get involved locally if you want to be interested in national politics. And so I figured out how to do that. So I volunteered for Webb Todd and worked for him at the state committee, which he funded out of his own pocket. He paid for the rent. He paid the people who, I was a volunteer, but he paid for the salaries of people who worked there. He'd buy our lunches when we went out to lunch.
Where was it?
It was on State Street in Trenton, down from the State House. And then we had some problems with the Young Republicans. He made me national youth coordinator, state youth coordinator, trying to straighten that one out. And then he said, you know, there's the state party in Essex County has been taken over by people that nobody trusts. So will you go down there and be finance chairman? Because people will not give money to the party unless there's somebody there they trust, and they'll trust you. And in those days it was very different than today, because there was no accounting whatsoever. If you were the treasurer of the party in Essex County, you'd go up to Prudential and they'd hand you an envelope, or AT&T and they'd hand you an envelope, or public service, and get another envelope, and inside the envelope would be a certain amount of cash. You didn't know till you got out of the room how much they'd given you, and you had no idea how much they were giving the other party. But you'd go and get these, these envelopes, and there was no public accounting whatsoever. So you could really
You could skim a little.
yeah, well, that's why they didn't want to trust. That's why I ended up as treasurer. Because I remember doing things. I mean, I remember when I picked up the election day money, which was about $40,000 you gave in Essex County. You gave a certain amount, I don't know what it was, $5, $6 a district to the district workers. I remember sitting on a stool. The county chairman picked it up with me, and I kept it. I didn't give him anything, but I kept it. And he said, "I want to stop with something to eat." I said, "What do you mean you want to stop with something to eat?" He said, "Yeah, there's a counter here." I was sitting at a counter, you know, getting a hamburger or something with this satchel between my knees with $40,000 in it. If people here know in this neighborhood we've got $40,000, we're not going to get out of here alive.
Let's go back to the very beginning. Where were you born?
New York City.
Why? What was going on in your parents'
My
lives?
father was working on Wall Street.
Was he was not a congressman yet?
No, he was working on Wall Street, and we had and because he was in the city, we had an apartment, a small apartment in the city.
Whereabouts?
I was so young when we left, 37th or 38th, somewhere down that part of town, and or maybe in a house actually. I don't know what it was. I left there when I was 3 or something. But family had that during the winter, and then we'd go home to New Jersey in the summertime. Yeah.
Go to Livingston.
Yeah.
To the house, which was essentially a summer house for your family in those days.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
there was a big stone thing. There was never much heat in it, so it was you put fireplaces and they smoked. So it was mostly a place we went in the summertime.
And then at some point he decided to run for Congress from New Jersey.
Yes. Yeah, from Livingston. Yeah, in Essex County.
And when he was successful right away?
Yeah, I think, I don't remember. I think he may have had a primary. He lost to Leon. I don't know, but he was successful fairly early on. Yeah, and I think he had a tight. I think there may have been an incumbent who had gotten in with Franklin Roosevelt in those days, and so I think he had to knock somebody out of office. I remember, but I don't remember who it was. But I was 3 or 4 years old. I don't
do you remember what district he represented?
It used to be the 12th district. Yeah, which was, he had, when I knew it best, and of course these districts change a bit from time to time, but he had basically a third of the city of Newark. And then he came up through Irvington, Maplewood, around Livingston, around through West Essex, Montclair. So that was basically the district.
An Essex County district, essentially.
Yes. He shared the county most of the time. I remember he shared it with Huey Adnizio and Pete Rodino.
They were the other members of Congress.
Yeah, and he had
they represented Newark.
They each had a third of the city.
was the ethnicity? What were the ethnic forces in that district?
He had the part of Newark he had was very heavily Jewish, and so was, as you went up toward South Aron to Mayfield, that was very heavy. So he had and to some degree I guess Livingston, but I know he was. It was a very that was probably the predominant group I remember. I mean, there were other ethnic groups obviously in the district, but I remember the Jewish community as being, his campaign manager was always Jewish. And I think his opponents were often Jewish, so it was a very important vote. And he carried it always. He was very, he got along, he was very, very involved in the founding of the State of Israel and the first congressman to speak up against the Holocaust on the floor of the House. And so he was, I grew up, you know, recognizing how important those issues were.
Do you know what year he stood up in the House of Representatives and criticized the Holocaust?
I want to say 43, 44, something that area. It's amazing to think that nobody else had ever done it. And L. Felsenberg, who wrote a book about me and has researched something, he has a theory that he was in league with Morgenthau, who worked in the Roosevelt administration and was frustrated with Roosevelt for not speaking out. And that Morgenthau, who knew my father, may well have made some calls into the House to see if he'd get some people to start talking about it. That's just a theory. I mean, there's no Al's theory. Because they knew each other and were obviously on the same side of those kind of issues. Or it may have just been that he had enough friends in this district who had family in Germany and Europe and knew about what was going on and brought it to his attention.
Was he a good father?
I don't know how you determine a good father. I mean,
Did you love your father?
I respected him. I respected him.
Did you have a happy childhood?
And biblically, I honored my father.
You honored your father.
That's right.
Did you have a happy childhood?
No, not particularly. I don't think. It was a... I grew up during the Second World War. And...
what year were you born?
1935. And so it was coming out of the Depression, Second World War. My father was away all the time, in Congress or wherever. My two brothers and my brother-in-law were away fighting in the war. My mother was volunteering, as what we called a gray lady in those years. Everybody worked for the war effort. And so I was generally alone growing up.
And then they sent you off to prep school at age 12.
12, yeah. Yeah.
You resented that initially.
More than initially. So resented. That's too young. That's too young to send somebody away.
Think so?
I do. I wouldn't send a kid away at 12.
That tradition has sort of died in this country, hasn't it?
Yeah, but there are still schools. I ran into some guy the other day who's a trustee of a school in New England that takes kids a lot earlier than that. And I said, who goes there? Well, you know, kids of divorced parents, kids with parents who are in the foreign service and out of the country. I mean, kids, you know, there's a market for those place to send your kid if you can't take care of it.
Did your father bring political people home?
No.
No?
Not that I remember much. I do remember meetings. You know, he'd have things at the house. If somebody's running for governor, they'd generally come do a fundraiser or whatever it was at the house, or a meeting, the back porch sort of, and speak off there. Generally not. I do remember in Washington, because I was very young and I didn't know what was going on, but if you'd asked me when I was 5, 6 years old, I would have told you the largest ethnic group in the district is African American. Because that's what I thought. Because in Washington, growing up in Washington, inevitably at Saturday lunch, we'd have some of the people from the district, very often from Montclair. They had a lot of very close friends in the African American community in Montclair, and they'd be there for lunch. And so I thought, you know, my mother would say, you know, these are people, these constituents from district, friends of your father, so fine. but they were always African American. And I didn't realize till later he couldn't take them to restaurants because Washington was still a segregated city, believe it or not. And I do remember that. I mean, I remember if you had an African American friend, you couldn't go to the movies together. You couldn't take people to a restaurant. I think of it now, it was dreadful. Eisenhower was the first one. Eisenhower called the restaurants personally, as I remember, and said it was outrageous in the nation's capital, and asked them personally to. Because there's no law that allowed him to do it. The president called him personally.
You did well with the African American community 30, 40 years later, and with the Jewish community. You think they associated you with your father?
No. Jewish community did, yes. Jewish community were memories of my father, yeah, very definitely. And always were when I first got running for office, because I ran some of the same areas that he ran in. And he was African American community. I think it was more. I mean, I marched with Dr. King, and I'd been very active in what they call that, civil rights.
From what age?
Always. I mean, I remember debating at Princeton. There were people in my class who were from the South who. We ended up at the Whig Suffrage Society, which was a debating society at Princeton. I ended up upholding the idea that they were upholding the idea that segregation was moving, desegregation was moving too fast, and these poor, benighted African American people who couldn't handle it because it was moving too fast. Believe it or not, that was a debating topic at Princeton, where we had, when I was at Princeton, one African American in the whole university at that point. One. Well, before I left, they had more. But not many more. Not many more. It was a southern school in many ways, Princeton. But anyway, I was always involved in those things. I was one of the earliest members, I think, in the North. Helped open up the northern headquarters of the Southern Christian Leadership Association on 125th Street in Harlem when I was a graduate student at Columbia. I was always involved in civil rights causes, one kind or another.
You said at the very beginning of this interview that you had Republican heroes and Democratic heroes. I don't know if you used the word heroes, but
sure.
You rooted for. You said I rooted for Republicans.
Yeah.
You said it was like sports. I knew you root for the Republicans, although you secretly rooted for some Democrats.
Oh, sure, not so secretly. When I was teaching, I was chairman at the school for the Kennedy campaign for president, and because I simply thought, like a lot of people my age at that point, I was just enamored of Kennedy. And I know I was in Massachusetts, which didn't hurt any. And so I was, faculty head or whatever of the Kennedy president. My father found out about it. Somebody called him and said, "You know what your son is doing?" And he said, "You really want to be doing that?" And I said, "Yeah, I do."
Was it a serious breach between you and him?
No, but I think he was not as serious as when I went to Princeton instead of Harvard, but still serious.
To Harvard?
Yes.
Did you choose Princeton?
I chose Princeton. Yeah, got admitted to both and chose Princeton.
Why?
My brother had been to Princeton. My older brother, much older than I am.
Which one?
Bob, who had been. He was a lot older. He's my godfather as well.
Your brother and your godfather.
Yeah, and he had been to Princeton, and he used to take me to football games, but only when he was sure Princeton was going to win. And I sort of wanted to go to Princeton. And I sort of wanted to go home to New Jersey, too. I'd been in Massachusetts too long. But I thought about it. My roommate went to Harvard and from the school, and I thought about it seriously, but then I decided no.
Who were the dominant Republican figures of your first 20 years and of the time when your father was in Congress?
Republican figures?
Yeah.
Bob Taft, Arthur Vandenberg.
Taft was the senator from Ohio.
Yeah.
Vandenberg was
known as Mr. Conservative. Vandenberg was from Michigan, and was the architect of the bipartisan foreign policy with Truman. And so both of those are the two probably most prominent. And then, of course, along came Joe McCarthy, who was around and became more and more prominent. In fact, I remember when my father was one of the first to come out against McCarthy in the Republican Party, and he got terrible mail. I mean, probably 10 or 12 to 1 against him, and letters written on orange paper with green ink, threats and everything else, and it was sort of scary. But McCarthy had, it's hard to think of it now, but McCarthy had a very strong and passionate following, and Republicans running for re-election really wanted McCarthy to come into their districts. And Democrats who were running, like Jack Kennedy, made deals. I mean, Kennedy Sr. made a deal to keep Joe McCarthy out of the district because he really was popular at that point, particularly among Irish Americans.
Obviously, that was before 1954 when those famous hearings pretty much destroyed McCarthy.
I listened to every one of those hearings in my freshman at Princeton.
You watched them, you say?
I watched them. There was a small television set on the Commons or somewhere. I went and watched almost all of those hearings. Yeah, loved them.
Who were the dominant New Jersey Republicans in those days?
Well, my mentor was Cliff Case, who was the last Republican senator probably from New Jersey, and somebody I liked and admired very, very much. He didn't always, my father and he didn't always agree, but I generally agreed with Case. And
was he more moderate than your father?
He was more liberal. I think you could almost use the word liberal with Cliff, and he wouldn't have been ashamed of that word. He was a very gentle man, and one of the nicest people I ever knew, a quiet sense of humor.
What part of the state did he come from?
Union County. Although he sort of moved down to Washington. I don't know if anybody knew what I cared in those days, but I think he had used his son-in-law's address and Rollway as his voting address, but he's basically went down to Washington.
How long did he serve?
I think about 2 terms, I think maybe. Yeah, he was but very respected across the aisle. Had a lot of friends, one of those people who had just as many friends on the Democratic side as he did on the Republican side. And he was one of the, the book that somebody's got to write from Rutgers or somewhere is the story of the, what you call moderate Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans, what? Because they were the ones who determined what the policy was in those days. I mean, Fritz Mondale told me that. He said every single important bill in my entire time in the Senate, it was really important and tough. People went to Chuck Percy and to Cliff Case and to Jake Javits and to Margaret Chase Smith and to Brooke and Saltonstall of Massachusetts and all these people, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and they could walk between the parties and they made the compromises. When people got too pitted this way and that way, they'd come together around these people. Nobody's ever written that book, but they were enormously influential. And Case was a leader in that group.
Your nostalgia in your voice for that form of republicanism.
Well, yeah, but I think I think any party that ever wants to be in the majority has got to be tolerant of differences within itself. Democrats are now. I mean, Democrats, Democrats go out to North Dakota and ask who the head of the local NRA is. When they find out, they try to get him to run as a Democrat, and they get elected. The Democrats now in the House who's come onto the floor with guns. They understand that a party has got to be a coalition, and if you want to learn about that, learn about the period when I was growing up, when Franklin Roosevelt tolerated the worst racists in this country. I had him in the White House as part of the Democratic coalition. In fact, they were his leading Democrats. They were chairs of the committee. I mean, Richard Russell ran the Congress for Franklin Roosevelt. And but that was, you wouldn't want to compromise with those people. But the idea of a broad coalition is the only time you can ever govern. When a party becomes narrower and narrower, as the Democrats did when they nominated McGovern, and in that period when the Democrats were at a Democratic convention, people looked at the delegates and said, "That's not who we want to govern us." And had a number of years until Bill Clinton came along and broadened the coalition again.
Did your parents talk about the family tradition? Was it an active part of growing up in your house, or not?
Not too much in our house. I had cousins, and I think it was more in their house. They lived in the old house in Elizabeth, and I think their mother was very much about preserving the house, preserving traditions, and so on. So we went over to visit them. You heard that, you saw that stuff. Or
which woman was that? Who was that?
Mary Alice Kean. She was my father's brother's wife.
Which brother?
John Kean. My father had one brother, and he died early, and she lived on, and made it her project to preserve the old trunks of papers, to make the old furniture out of the barn into the main house, to get out the old family portraits, and really preserve it for future generations. She deserved a lot of credit for it.
Did that interest you as a young man?
No, it didn't interest me as a young man. I got interested in this particular guy at Princeton, the Polish fellow. But no, I didn't. I think I became interested in family after I became interested in history, as opposed to becoming interested in the family and then becoming interested in history. I think it was the reverse. I think because it's history, and I suddenly started running into people with the same name in history that got to be interesting.
Your father ran for the U.S. Senate in 1958.
Yes.
Against Harrison Williams?
Yep.
Did you play a role in that campaign?
Yeah, not willingly. I had just gotten out of Princeton, or just getting out of Princeton, I guess. The campaign was warming up, and you can't, and I obviously didn't have a job yet. And if you're jobless going out of college, and your father is running for the United States Senate, you basically are told to help, which I did. And I worked in the headquarters with some fascinating people. There were very wonderful. There's a guy called Joe Sullivan, who'd been a reporter for the Star Ledger and the News. He used to write the political column, worked for my father. And
the one who would later work for the New York Times?
No, this is another Joe Sullivan. This is before that. This is way back. I guess he was a columnist for the Ledger. He wrote the political column then, back in the, I guess, 40s, 50s. And then my father hired him. And another guy called Williams, who had been with Vanderbilt, the clean government thing in Essex County when he was running the party, and they just had stories upon stories upon stories, which were fun to listen to about politics, about what really happened. And
so you were pretty interested in politics, even.
I got very interested in that, and in them, and I loved talking to them, and then one day. Forget it, right. There was a meeting in Union County that I guess there was a surrogate taking my father's place to address, but it was a fairly important one, I guess. The town was important in the present primary. And he had a tough primary. And because most of the party leaders were backing his opponent.
Do you remember who
which
that
I inherited.
Who?
Which I inherited, the party leaders backing my opponents. But he ran against two people. One was Vern Shanley, who we knew because he lived almost next door to us in Washington. Eisenhower's appointment secretary, and was the national committeeman for the Republican Party, and therefore had a lot more contacts among the counties and the county chairman than my father did. And a fellow called Bob Morris, who was a right-winger, very conservative guy, but the conservatives in those days meant foreign policy conservative and fiscal conservative. You didn't have any of the social issues dividing the party. So it was those two, and Shanley had the majority of the party support. And but they said, "Can you go down and represent your father at this meeting in Union County?" And I said, "What do I have to do?" And I said, "Well, just shake hands and so on." And I said, "Fine, but I don't speak," because I'd never spoken. I'd had a bad stutter as a child and still had a little remnants of it left, and I didn't. So I said, "No, you don't have to speak, just shake hands and represent your father." So I went, "Fine." So I got to the party late, as I'm usually late for most things, and they'd already started the program. And when I was running at the mayor, Hatfield of Fenwood, I think it was, came up and said, Flo Dwyer's representative was going to speak, who was a congresswoman, and then you're next. I said, next doing what? Speaking. I said, I'm not here to speak. He said, yeah, just say a couple of words. And I'd never spoken other than high school or college debate, ever. And I was scared to death. I got up there, and I don't know what I said. I don't remember what I said to this day. But I just know I got out of there as fast as I could afterwards. Went back basically and said in the headquarters, don't ever make me do that again. And then Flo Dwyer's assistant, a woman called B. Arthur, who was her administrative assistant, called and said, you know, he gave one of the best talks I've heard in a long time, and he's the best representative his father could possibly have getting out in the road. And I said, I don't believe that. And then the mayor called. And the mayor said, you know, he was terrific last night. And can we get him back? And I sort of figured, maybe I can do this. So after that, I was sent out as a surrogate, even to the extent occasionally of being there with my father's opponents when he couldn't be there.
So your father won that primary?
He won the primary.
And what was the general election about? Do you recall?
It was a bad year for the Republicans. They lost nationally in a big way. It was a year of Eisenhower got into trouble. He had a aide called Sherman Adams, who had a problem with the Vicuna Code, as I remember it. He had illegally and had to quit, and a whole bunch of stuff. And the Republicans lost. And my father was outspent. I guess, I don't know why. I guess the Democrats had control of the state in those days. Bob Minor was governor. And when you have control of the state, you can raise money. And so he was outspent by Williams. And television was just coming in. A couple of things on television, I remember. But he just didn't, you know, he didn't make it. But it was a... I'm being annoyed about that, too.
You were annoyed?
Well, more than annoyed, because I was convinced he was much more qualified. And he got all the editorial endorsements. I mean, the press was convinced he was more qualified, too, because the Newark News is no lecturer. He was a small-town lawyer from Union County who had one term in the House, that's all. But a very attractive presence, and able on his feet, and nice guy. And was more, I think he was much more, my father was never a good speaker.
No?
No. And I don't know if he ever knew that he wasn't, but he wasn't. Because people serve in Congress for a long time think they're good speakers, you know, because everybody claps when they come into rooms, but a lot of them aren't. He wasn't. He knew his facts. I mean, he really knew the issues, but he was not good in his feet. And Pete was better.
Back to your speaking. You said you had this stuttering problem and a vestige of it by the time you worked in this campaign, and yet you also said that you had done debating at Princeton and at St. Mark's.
Yeah, but that's different. I mean, yeah, I'd done it, but not well.
Had the stuttering gotten in your way in debate, or
yes,
yes,
a bit, yes. What you have to do if you're a stutterer, and I still, if you learn how to do things, you have to pick different words. If you feel a word coming and you start to stutter, you think of a synonym and get it out as fast as you can. Some stutterers almost sing a little bit because nobody stutters singing. And you compensate. You find ways around it. But the one thing you can't compensate for is when you have to say a word and you can't think of a substitute. When I was in the Army, you know, they'd have roll call. You're supposed to say your name. You can't say another name. And I would break out into a sweat as it started to get closer to me, see whether I was going to be able to get my name out.
Wow.
Yeah, it was awful. And in
Did
class.
you have professional help for that?
No, it wasn't any much. I didn't give people much professional help, I don't think, in those days. But it was in class, you know, you never raise your hand, because the kids would laugh at you if you raised your hand, nothing came out. So you pretend you didn't know the answer. You just didn't want to be called on. If you knew the answer, you pretended you didn't.
How ironic that you become a statesman and required to deliver speeches
Yeah.
and
Well,
make remarks for the rest of your life.
It was long. It was a lot of doing it, really. I mean, I don't think I was very good when I started out campaigning in Irvington, the Republican primary for the Assembly. But you do it enough, and you get, you learn how to do things. And when I was running for governor, my friend Phil Kaltenbacher, who was then head of, I think, the Young Presidents Organization in New Jersey, said they had a woman on the payroll in New York, and she was a speech coach. He said, "I want you to go." And I said, I'd been in the Assembly then for a number of years. I don't speak. I don't need a speech coach. He said, "Do it as a favor to me." Well, he was my finance chairman, so if finance chairman asked you to do something, you probably went and did it. So I said, okay. So I went in, took an afternoon, went in to see her. Her name was Dorothy Sarnoff. She just died. And she'd been on Broadway, and she had history, and she had me talking to a camera. And I left and went back, and Phil called me and said, "How'd it go?" I said, "I don't think it did me any good whatsoever." But she said, I remember she said a couple of things. She said, "You talk like a teacher. You use words and gestures and so on. You've got to speak louder. You've got to emphasize words more. You've got to be more forceful." And I remember her saying that. And so what? But after that, people started saying, "He's really improved as a speaker." One session with a woman. Which people commented in the campaign trail that he's a much better speaker. So it did me some good.
Was there someone at St. Mark's who helped you with speaking?
No, just with self-confidence. I mean, there were a couple of teachers who, as I say, went way beyond what they had to do, and really gave me a little self-confidence when I didn't have any. I mean, I was failing subjects that I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand why I had to spend so much time and couldn't do it as well as other people. I was ducking in class because of the stutter. I never wanted to, so people used to say I'd never volunteered and probably didn't know anything in class. And I was known, the first couple of years I was known as a dumb kid. And so there's letters of my parents saying, "I don't think he's going to make it."
There must have been a lot of surprise to people when you became governor of New Jersey. People from your earlier life.
And later life, too. Princeton classmates have told me. I remember I've got a... Because when I was at Princeton, I was running that camp. And rather than get into the Princeton activities, I had to, at that point, I had to hire the council. I had to worry about the kids, whether we were getting the right neediest kids. And I was around Boston, most of them, although some came Jersey City and Newark. And I had the doctor, I had the chef, I had all that kind of thing. So that's what I was doing at Princeton. And I remember... So I didn't know many people in my class, and I came back, it was the 25th reunion, I think I was governor. And I have another classmate called Carl Icahn. And Carl sides up to me, and he's got a sense of humor. Carl sides up to me and he says, "Yeah, remember so-and-so and so-and-so and so, they were our class officers and everything over there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "They didn't know who we were. And now I don't remember who they are." Typical Icahn comment.
You said earlier that the camp meant more to you than almost anything that you've undertaken in your life.
That's right.
Tell us a little more about how you got involved in it and why it means so much in hindsight.
Well, I got involved a little bit by accident. They were recruiting people at St. Mark's to go up there and volunteer for 2 weeks as a counselor. And the assistant headmaster was involved in the camp. And so he asked everybody to at least come to the first meeting in our class, even whether you're going to come or not. And so I did, most of the class did. And I didn't think much more about it. I had not recognized that one of my brothers had written to the assistant headmaster and said, he's a mess. And maybe the camp would help him out. I think you can get him up there. So toward the end of the school year, he came up to me and said, "I've slotted you in for second term." I said, "Second term what?" "The camp." And I said, "Well, I don't think I'm going there." And he said, "Yes, you are. You've got your set, and we need you and all that." So I went on up there with some trepidation, and when you go up there, you were put in charge of a cabin of kids who were the oldest kids were within a year of my age. my age at that point. And
Which was what, 15, 16?
yeah, and they, I guess I was probably 16, they were 50, the oldest were 15. And they, but they have artificial barriers to try and make the age. You have to call the counselors mister. And so the kids don't think you're close to their age. It's a funny sort of psychological thing. So I ended up in charge of a cabin of 10 kids from inner city Newark, Boston, Jersey City.
African American?
Some.
Some.
Yeah.
Not all.
No. It was, I guess about a third, maybe African American. And they were tough kids. And it was a little bit sink or swim. But I got to like the kids very much, and like working with them and helping them out in one thing and another. And I kept in touch with them. And then I went back the following year again to work for two weeks. And then they asked me, because somebody left, could you stay around? I said, yeah, I stayed all summer. And ended up as getting, and in a job like that, you were given responsibilities that were way beyond your years. I was swimming director for part of that summer for the whole camp. I was a number of jobs like that, which were, again, more responsibilities than any other 16 or 17-year-old I knew had. And so, and I liked it. And I took to it, and I took to the kids. And a lot of the kids in Kean, and some of the kids who were very good graduated to become counselors. And so we all lived together, and so I was living together with kids from all walks of life.
Was it your brother Bob who had encouraged you to get in?
No, my other brother Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Yeah. And so he didn't encourage me. He just wrote the guy and said, get him. Didn't tell me about it.
How much older is Hamilton than you?
About 11 years.
And Bob?
15 years, I guess.
How many summers did you do this?
I did it all through college. Ended up running the place.
What's the name of the place?
Brantwood Camp. Still going.
Brentwood?
Brantwood. B-R-A-N-T-O-U. It's still going strong. And still doing a great job. Now they got a girls' camp, too. And so they...
Have you been back?
Yep.
When?
Last time I was back was about 3 years ago, I guess. Yeah. And there's a group of us who were great friends who were on the council at that period. One ex-camper, another guy who was a couple of years below me at St. Mark's, another guy who was a couple of years above me at St. Mark's, and we get together. I'm being honored at St. Mark's in another couple of weeks, I guess, and they're all coming. All my old friends from Brentwood.
One of my colleagues seems to remember that your family also hosted Fresh Air Fund kids. Is that correct?
Fresh Air Come. My father was probably kept the Newark Boys Club going. He had a friend called Dave Wiener who ran the Newark Boys Club, and there was a transition to try and get it from what had been a primarily Jewish, probably led organization, as a city turned African American. And it was long before Ray Chambers or any of those people came along, and there was no help and no money. And my father was very active in it, both going down there and also I know helping Dave financially, raising money for it. He was very interested. And he also founded the Boy Scouts in Livingston. He's always very interested in kids.
You majored in history at Princeton.
Yeah.
Did you belong to an eating club?
Everybody did in those days. It was an awful system. It really was. I mean, because it was discriminatory. It was, they would come into your room and they'd decide to talk to you and not somebody else, so somebody else, not you. No, I went into something called Campus Club, which was sort of in my sort of a musical club. I mean, a lot of the people who've been musical organizations run it.
Were you musical?
Just, I liked me. I've always loved music. I can't do much with it myself, but I've always loved it.
Was there a professor that stands out in your memory?
Yeah, a number of them. A wonderful teacher, I didn't know that well, but Eric Goldman, I took every course he ever did. He was modern American, wrote a book, I think won the prize, called Rendezvous with Destiny, about the Franklin Roosevelt period. A number of other books, but he was a brilliant lecturer, fascinating teacher, and just got your interest. Then the guy I studied with is a guy called R.R. Palmer, who won the Bancroft Prize for a book called The Age of the Democratic Revolutions, which he mentions me in the preface.
What did you say?
Just it was partly based on some work I'd done. But he prepared his work from note cards he kept, and he took note cards out of my thesis and had them. When he was writing the chapter, he found stuff that pertained, so he used it and gave me credit. So I was in graduate school at Columbia then, and people said, "Do you really mention you won a Bancroft Prize? You mentioned?" That was one of my high points. But he was R.R. Palmer was a wonderful, wonderful professor and a real scholar. And now there was Princeton had some, and still does, of course, some wonderful professors, wonderful teachers.
Besides Carl Icahn, did you have any other classmates who would go on to become prominent?
Yeah, a bunch of them. I'd have to come up sometime with their names for you. But yeah, we had one who was in the cabinet, I guess, one who was head of a major corporation, another one was, his name, he was a journalist and head of a foundation. Yeah, we got a number of, we have a very, another was head of Goldman Sachs. Yeah, we had a successful class.
Class of
7.
Were you the only member of your immediate family who would end up going into politics?
Yeah. Yeah, and I was probably the one, if you ask my father, I was probably the one he least expected. Because, my brother Bob was very successful in his life, I think, student, everything else, and was a highly decorated in the Second World War, and he might have thought he'd go into politics. My brother Hamilton was a good lawyer, prominent lawyer with a Newark law firm at that point, and had an interest in politics. So I think my father would have suggested that probably one of them might do it, but the kid didn't do very well in school and stuttered. I don't think he would have I don't think he would have expected me to.
What did those brothers end up doing?
Hamilton was a lawyer. He moved to New York and got very involved in a number of charitable causes, and particularly environmental. Was a lawyer for the Environmental Defense Fund and a number of other good causes. And my brother Bob ended up as chairing the Elizabethtown Water Company and being very active in New Jersey, a number of business organizations.
And we think of the Elizabethtown Water Company and the Elizabethtown Gas Company as Kean family businesses. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. It is. My Uncle John, my father's brother, headed both of them. And then when they got bigger, one person couldn't head both of them, and so my cousin John ended up heading the gas company, and my brother Bob ended up heading the water company.
And who were your other siblings?
I've got a sister who was married, called Rose Lansbury, who got involved in the theater. Her sister-in-law was Angela Lansbury. Her husband was a producer at Broadway. And I've got another sister who was got very involved in quite radical causes. Was a friend of, been very active in Haiti, and was a friend of the president of Haiti, who tried to help out and made a movie about Haiti and his cause.
Aristide, that president?
Yes. Yeah, she was, and it was by far the most liberal member of the family.
What's her name?
Catherine. Yeah.
And then there's one more.
Who did I forget?
Bob, Hamilton, Rose, yeah. Catherine.
And me.
And you, but
and Bob.
5.
Bob.
No, we have Bob. So
3 boys, myself, Bob, and Ham, and 3 girls, Rose, Catherine, oh, Beth, my oldest sister. Yeah, my oldest sister married a school teacher in Greenwich. Always been the leader of the family.
She has?
Always, yeah.
Was she the firstborn?
Yes. I think had she been born in another era, she would have been heading something. And she's a wonderful person who never lost a friend. I mean, she's still friends with people she was friends with in grade school. And she had a tough life in some ways, but she's been terrific. You know.
Are all your siblings alive?
Yes, all 6 of us.
Do you get together?
Yeah, when she gets us together. Yeah, she's organized some family reunions. It's a little harder now because there are descendants of my father and mother that are now between 80 and 100. So it makes it a little harder to get together. I don't give them all presents.
Going back to the 1958 election, I don't know that I remember the answer to my question of what you said. You said it was a bad year for Republicans. That Sherman Adams had problems in the White House.
Yeah,
it was also the 6th year of Republican administration.
Yeah.
How did your father take his defeat?
Well, he wasn't happy about it. He got involved in other things. I mean, he got very involved again at St. Barnabas Hospital, where he became chairman of the board and eventually moved it to Livingston and built it. He was in charge of building the thing. And he became, for a while, Republican county chairman, because they couldn't agree on anybody else.
So he absorbed the blow and moved on.
Yeah. He's always very interested in finance. I mean, he was, one of the ranking Republicans in the Ways and Means Committee. He wrote a lot of the tax code. Was known as Mr. Social Security. He wrote the present Social Security, or the Social Security law up to that point was his work. And so...
he wrote the Social Security law?
Yeah, not the original, not the Franklin Roosevelt original one. But when it got rewritten to expand, cover a lot more people, he was the one who wrote it, yeah.
Is that his legacy? I
think, yeah. So he would have been proud of Social Security as anything he did, probably. I would think he was the expert in Congress on that subject, and anybody wanted to know anything about Social Security went to him. He's great friends with the people in every administration who worked in Health and Human Services and that area.
Did he retire from Congress, or did he get defeated?
He got defeated because he ran for the Senate. That's people.
Oh, that was the end of his congressional career. He
was
didn't go back to the House.
No, he was there 20 years.
Right,
you don't go back; you lose all your seniority. He stayed in Washington. Eisenhower appointed him the first head of the Commission on Aging, because of his Social Security background, and then Kennedy kept him on. So we sort of knew the Kennedys, so kept him on.
Did you have any other Democratic figures that captured your imagination other than JFK? Not that
I actively campaigned for or supported. No. Although, you kind of growing up, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was the president. It wasn't. I'd never known any other president all my life. He was the great hero of the Second World War and all of that. All of us.
Do you think he was a great president?
Oh yes. My father didn't. Particularly, he just disagreed with him on too much. I think. He was. I think. Oh yes, he's one of our. I think he's one of our. I don't think he's our greatest president, but I think he's up there.
Back to Social Security.
Yeah, we knew him. He's a cousin.
Really?
Yeah. Eleanor's closer cousin. Yeah, we were the Franklin Roosevelt, the Teddy Roosevelt side.
Say it again. What's the connection?
We're on my brother could tell you much more about family connections than I can, but one of the Keans married a Roosevelt, I guess. And, Teddy's, I don't know, uncle. I don't know what it was, but we're Roosevelts. So.
Well, did you think of President Roosevelt as a relative of yours when you were growing up?
No. Eleanor was.
Eleanor was.
If you're related to one, you're related to the other. But Franklin was much more distant than Eleanor was. Eleanor was closer because she was Teddy's side.
Did you have any contact with them?
Oh, yeah.
What kind of contact?
Not a lot, but not with Franklin. I was just too young. But my father had a story. When he was first elected to Congress, the president always has a reception for new congressmen, and so they were all lined up. This is 38, which was the year the Republicans came back. Actually, Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court and all of that. There was a bunch of Republicans elected, and so it was a long line, mostly Republicans, and new congressmen. And my father was in it. And Franklin Roosevelt was sitting there greeting him in the reception line. And he spotted my father about 10 people down the line and said, "Oh my God, Bob Kean, at last a friend." And he said, my father said, "The Republicans parted like the Red Sea." He said, "He's there standing alone, you know." And he said, he thinks it cost him a committee slot. But he was, no, Eleanor I did see from time to time, and she was remarkable. I mean, she was, you know, if you saw Eleanor Roosevelt, she was usually all by herself. Probably the best known woman in the world. And I saw on street corners trying to catch a taxi in the rain. I saw her taking a train when I was going up to St. Mark's. I was in the coach car. She was in the coach car. Nobody with her, sitting reading a book. And she came up, actually, one of her grandchildren graduated 2 or 3 years ahead of me at St. Mark's, and she came and gave the speech. So I saw her from time to time, and she was...
Did she know you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Not well, she knew
who you were. She
knew I was. Yeah. Yeah. We didn't see it enough, so I can say she really knew me. But
did you like her?
Yeah, I think I didn't have any reason not to. Yeah. She was, I was proud of her. You know.
We're going to take a break in a minute, but let me just ask you one more question before we do that. You sort of broke ranks with your family's tradition to back John F. Kennedy for president and be his, what, you were the head of his campaign.
Just in the school.
In the school at St. Mark's.
Yeah.
Do you recall his assassination?
Never forget it. Very, very clearly. Everybody does, I think. Exactly as I was at graduate school in Columbia. I was studying in a library downtown, and I heard people talking in lower floor and raising voices, and it was a library, so you don't hear people raising voices ordinarily. So I went downstairs to see what was happening, and I heard about it. He'd just been shot then. The word wasn't good, but he was still alive. I remember I left and I just walked in New York City. And people were stopping, you know, some cabs and cars were stopping, and people were talking to each other, and people were asking if he heard anything, and so on. By the time I got back to my apartment, an apartment in New York, over on the west side, he was dead. And I sat alone for the next day. I didn't go to school the next day. Just sat alone in the apartment, watched television, thought about it.
All right, let's take a break.
Some of my professors couldn't show up for that week. Some of my professors said I can't teach. Just cancel their classes.
Governor, we want to get into your political career in this session, but before we do, Don just brought up the 60s and the time of unrest and anti-war sentiment among people your age. What was your orientation toward all that?
I was anti-war.
You were?
Yeah. In fact, I think in the New Jersey Assembly, I think I was the only Republican to vote on, you know, New Jersey Assembly gets into things that are none of their business. Of course, they couldn't do anything about the war, but there was a resolution I think they put on to embarrass the Republicans because the war was unpopular at that point. They put some sort of resolution up, and I think I was a speaker, a majority leader. I voted for it because I didn't like the war at all. I would get it. So I did, every now and then I did things like this, and I'd hear from some of my fellow Republicans. But
all right, well then let's get you into the Assembly. You went to the '64 convention as a Scranton operative. You had this wonderful experience that you described previously. How did a political career develop out of that?
Well, by accident. I mean, a lot of my career is, you know, a New Jersey philosopher, Yogi Berra, asked once whether these things he said, he thought of them ahead of time. And he said, no, they sort of come serendipitous-like. And my career has been like that because I didn't have any intention of running for the Assembly whatsoever. Never even been to Trenton, I don't think, ever, except for a couple of working with Webb Todd a little bit for the Republicans. But I was doing some working for the Essex County. People knew me because I'd done some work for the county chairman. And the head of Hoffman LaRoche decided he wanted to run for governor.
Who was that?
No, Obst was Warren Lambert. Italian-American. He wanted to be the first Italian-American governor. And he, I'll think of his name in a minute, but people told him he couldn't do that unless he could control his own county. Now, in those days, there was no disclosure of where your money came from. So he's getting out of Switzerland, I think, over LaRoche. But he had tons of money. And using the money, he put together a ticket against the whole organization Republican ticket.
Would this be in 65? For the 65 gubernatorial?
67, I think. It wasn't gubernatorial. It was a year after, I think, 2 years later. And so he put together a ticket and got people who had served and got some very prominent Republicans out of the ticket. And so the organization had to put together its own ticket. And in Essex County, those days, everybody ran countywide except the Assembly, which had just been told. The senators were still running countywide. But you put all the county officials, in those days you had a coroner as well as all the freeholders and the county clerks and all that kind of thing. You had a ticket that went the length of this room, and they had trouble filling it up. So they asked me if I'd run for the Assembly. I think basically figuring my father's name was still pretty good in Essex County, and maybe that would be good for them in the primary.
This is 67?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I thought about it and thought, well, what can I lose? I'm not doing anything else very interesting in my life right now.
What were you doing?
I was running a small real estate investment corporation, Elizabeth.
In Elizabeth?
Mostly family stuff that I was putting together.
Were you married?
Yes. No, I wasn't. No, excuse me, I was not yet married. I was in the process of getting engaged and getting married in that same year. But so I said, okay, and they made the same approach to a fellow called Phil Kaltenbacher, who turned out to be one of my best friends. We didn't know each other at the time, but his father had been fairly prominent in the Jewish community and had a seat in Lever and Newark. And so the two of us were asked to run for the organization.
Who was the senator from Essex County, do you recall?
Well, lots of them. You see, there were 5, all ran countywide. And there was a guy called Giuliani. I don't know who it was the old Democrats then. The Democrats were in charge, so we were running. Both sides were running in a Republican primary, but then the winner would have to run against the Democratic ticket. And it was trying to remember who they're very prominent. The Democrats were in total control of the legislature, and Dick Hughes was governor. And they had, I don't think they had a veto-proof majority, but they had close. And they had been in control for a while. And so they asked me to run. And, of course, we had this big primary first. And they hired everybody in sight because they had all the money, the so-called reform, they call themselves the Reform Republicans. And we were the Organization Republicans. And so, in general, they won most of the slots, but not all of them. We won, Phil and I. There was a couple of candidates from Newark who won. One of the senators came through, a guy called Giuliani. And the whole rest of the ticket went, I think, to the so-called Reform people. And so we didn't, we were sort of on the outs. We'd won the primary, but we weren't with the group. But we started meeting together from time to time. I remember they hired a guy who ended up as a columnist for the New York Times as their public relations director. Well, a guy called Walter Weller ran the campaign for the Hoffman LaRoche. He was the number 2 at Hoffman LaRoche. And what was his name? The guy who was a conservative columnist for years for the New York Times, writes a word column in the Sunday magazine section.
William Sapphire.
Bill Sapphire. Bill Sapphire was hired. So that was the kind of money they were spending. He was in the public relations business at that point. And so we had this money now behind the ticket because they couldn't say vote for everybody except these 2 guys in our district. And it turned out to be, first of all, after we'd won the primary, it came to be a total Republican year because there was an issue called S-400 in the ballot, where the Democrats had passed a bill saying that strikers deserved unemployment benefits. even though the strike was voluntary and all that. And that put the business community really in arms and didn't seem logical to people. At the same time, although it was a quiet issue, it never became much of a campaign, although my opponent accused me of being for it. Hughes' education commissioner, a guy called Carl Marburger, started to promote busing. And while that wasn't the S-400, which is a big visible issue, I think it was underground. I think people were very worried about kids getting bussed around, and I think that was part of it. But it turned into a huge landslide where we went from a fairly small minority into a huge majority.
In the legislature?
Yeah, huge majority, veto-proof majority. In Hughes' last couple of years. And
was that a tough issue for you, the busing, given your interest in civil rights?
Yeah, I'd say it became an issue in my district because I was supporting it.
You were supporting it?
Yeah, there's a guy, I remember my opponent, one of my opponents was a conservative Democrat. And actually the family had supported my father years ago, so they were sort of half friends, but I don't think I wasn't out there, raising the flag for it, but I was not criticizing him either. And so he came out and accused me of being for busing. Toward the end of the campaign, it was sort of one of these desperation things when you think you're losing, you throw everything you can, like the kitchen sink, into it. And I don't think it didn't catch fire at all. But.
So you went down to Trenton.
Yep. By the way, campaigning, Irvington was my big town, and I learned a lot because first I figured out mathematically that if I could hold Irvington even, there was no way I could lose.
What was Irvington like back then?
It was a pretty heavily Democratic town, but very ethnic. It had at that point a fairly small African American population, but it had a heavy Polish, German, small neighborhood of Jewish. Union, big Union town. The centers of power were often some of the big parishes. There was Monsignor Wojak, who was a big Polish Monsignor, and he's supposed to give you the wink, and you got his wink, you got a whole bunch of votes there. And I learned a lot campaigning in very tough ethnic areas, and a lot of senior citizens. I learned a lot there too. There were a lot of senior citizens living in very poor conditions, bolts in their doors because they didn't ever want anybody to come in. And you'd get in, finally when they'd let you in, you'd find out the son was a lawyer in Short Hills, and you wonder why the hell were you living in here? The son was a lawyer in Short Hills. A lot of that. A lot of people living in very fancy suburbs with parents who were eking out a living in pretty bad conditions in Irvington. But I beat those areas to death. I mean, I went back and back and back, so the old ladies in those projects would see me coming, here's that nice young fella again, and carried the projects, which no Republican ever done before. And
you and Kaltenbacher, or just you?
I ran ahead of him, but not a great deal, I think. I probably both carried most of them. He worked hard too. I mean, we just beat the town. We lived in Irvington. We almost moved in. We were down there every single day, and back and back and back and back. And I learned, that people get to know you, and you get to know you care about them. And you don't just come once and come back and back. That they'll support you. And I never forgot that. And also, I also learned that if you carry Democratic areas, each vote is worth 2. There's a vote your opponent's not getting. So when I ran for office later on, and people always question, what are you doing in cities? Why are you in African American neighborhoods? Why are you campaigning in these areas? The Republican Party never understood that. I understood it. Probably why I won that close election. I did a lot of that.
Did you enjoy campaigning?
I got to, yeah. I did. I like meeting people. I like people. I keep God alive. I know there are people in politics who don't really like people that much, but I don't know how they do it. I mean, I don't, because I think you have to. I mean, to enjoy it, you've got to like people. And I did. And people are all different. They've all got their own problems. And some of them are pains in the neck, but that's part of the game. And I liked it. Found out I liked it. The more I did it, the more I found out I enjoyed it.
So you would have been about 30 years old at this point.
Yeah.
And you were in the process of getting married.
And Phil and I would campaign together. I'd just gotten married. I got married this spring.
Spring of '67?
Yeah, and then
How did you meet Debbie?
Met Debbie. I took out a girl when I was going to graduate school in New York, and went with her to a party, and Debbie was there. And I sort of figured, no, actually Debbie wasn't there. Her roommate was there. I took out her roommate. Debbie was there too, but I took out Debbie's roommate. And then would see Debbie because she was rooming with the roommate, and gradually decided how to switch. And then I got into Wilmington. She went back to Wilmington. She was from Wilmington, and so I spent a lot of time the year before commuting on the Turnpike, back and forth to Wilmington. But I'd be working. I'd go down Friday night, spend a weekend, and drive back late Sunday night.
You decided you were tired of the commute.
Yeah.
So the beginning of your legislative career and your marriage sort of coincided.
Yeah, absolutely coincided. In fact, in our wedding album, one of the best political operatives in Essex County, and one of the people nobody trusted, was a guy called Joe Entile. And Joe Entile came to the wedding, and the picture of at my wedding, he's on the sofa, and I know what he's saying. He's telling me, we got to get a couple of checks to these leaders before we go on your honeymoon.
How did Debbie like politics?
Never really liked it. Never.
I know by the time you were governor, she wasn't crazy about
No, she never was.
it. But
She never was. We had fun for a while because Phil Kaltenbacher and his wife and Debbie and I were the same age. We all got along together very, very well, and we had fun. We laughed all the way through. So that was sort of fun. But then when it got more heated up, she didn't like it really at all. Yeah. And I kind of got elected. The majority of the people who got elected with me, of course, were from the Reform faction, not my faction.
So do you recall going down to Trenton to serve?
Yeah.
For the first time?
Yeah, I do. Getting sworn in, and meeting all the. It's fascinating meeting other people in the legislature. I guess it's probably the same way, but the legislature in those days was certainly very representative of the state. And you met people who were from every walk of life, people with PhDs and people with no education whatsoever, people who were union leaders and people who ran small businesses. The legislature had a lot more able lawyers in it in those days, because a lot of the major state law firms in the state encouraged the young people coming up to do the legislature for 2 or 4 years, and thought it was good for the firm and good for them. And so we had the best young lawyers in the state in the legislature, until the conflict of interest days, when it turned out that some of the lawyers in the legislature, I guess, had pushed their firms or something. So when, after Watergate, when all these great reforms went through, they passed this stupid law, which I voted for, which I always regretted, that said and still in fact, you cannot work for a law firm which does business with the state. Now, every major law firm in the state does business with the state. So all of them, including Bob Willents, who was my best friend in the legislature, had to resign. And we lost them. We lost the brightest people in the legislature, or some of them. And we were left with lawyers who either represented small towns, or insurance brokers, or, just didn't do any business with the state, which is small town lawyers. And it was a great mistake. I tried to get it repealed when I was governor, and they wouldn't touch it. They said, we were going to be accused of going back on ethics. But it's a wrong law, because it's kept very able people out of the legislature ever since. But anyway, that was before that time, and we had brilliant lawyers in the legislature, brilliant young lawyers who were very helpful to the process in both parties.
You would have a later history with Willents, but we'll get to that. Did you sponsor legislation in your first
Yeah,
term?
well, it turned out that, and again, this is sort of accident kind of stuff, they all, I guess, sort of liked me in the delegation, and they didn't all like each other. So they elected me delegation leader in the Assembly, even though I was from the minority faction of the organization, which really annoyed the then Reform Republicans.
When you say delegation leader, delegation from your district?
No, from the county.
From the county?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I was the leader of the largest delegation in the legislature.
The Essex County delegation.
Yeah, which then was the biggest. And so I therefore was given all the urban. This was the year of the riots, and that first term, and I was given all the. I mean, I was very involved in it because I had the district went right down to Newark, and when I was redistricted, I had part of Newark, so I had a lot of interest anyway. And Springfield Avenue, of course, went right down through the center of the riots, which was my district. But all the urban legislation that came had to come through me. I sponsored all of it. First urban aid bill in the state ever. All the recommendations that were put together by various commissions as to what could be done to prevent riots in the future.
So
In the process, I wrote, by the way, the bill I'm most proud of.
Which is?
Which is the Education Opportunity Fund. It's probably helped more kids than anything else.
Is that what we call tag grants?
No. This is
EOF, that's right.
Yeah, EOF. It's the largest fellowship program in the state now, and has been for a number of years. And it came out of a conversation I had with a guy called Harry Smith, who was then head of Essex County College. And I said, "What are your problems, and what can I do for you?" This was my first term in the Assembly. And he said, "You know, I can't tell you the number of kids who can do the work here, but cannot afford to be here because they have to help their families, and they just can't take the time to be." And he said, "If we had some money." So I put together a bill. Basically, it was based on the fact that anybody who was able should be allowed to have a college education in New Jersey. And there's a fellow called Ralph Duncan, and Ralph was Dick Hughes' Commissioner of Higher Education, Chancellor, I guess. And Ralph called me and said, "You put in this bill." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You know, I've been working on a bill that's similar, and could you come see me?" So I did. And he had a different idea, but a complementary idea. And his idea was that these lower income kids, when you got them into college, had been to such terrible schools that they were flunking right out again. And so they were, you got them in, but you couldn't keep them in because they hadn't been prepared properly by life and by the school they were in. So we put the two bills together. So it supplied money, but also supplied a separate fund which would give these kids mentoring and tutoring, with some before they went to the college and then for the first couple of years. It's been one of the most successful programs in the entire country. I mean, we have people who are mayors, and we had a member of the president's cabinet, we had sub-cabinet, I guess, we had just lawyers, teachers, every profession you can think of. And every now and then we have a 10-year reunion or something, and I go, and these people come up and say, "You know, we're not for that program. We never would have been able to do what we're doing." So I'm almost as proud of that as anything I ever did in public life. Just, yeah, and it was, and then I had trouble getting it through.
Did?
I got it through the Assembly because I was powerful enough in the Assembly. By that time I had made alliance with the Bergen delegation. The Bergen delegation, we figured that if the Essex and Bergen delegations got together, it was very hard to stop whatever we were trying to do. So I'd do some things to help Bergen. I had an alliance, and I was getting things through then. And they helped me with the whole urban package. But it got to the Senate, and there's a guy called Bill Herring. And he said it's going to be a huge waste of money. It's not going to help my district, which is Ocean County, one bit. And he was chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate. He's blocked it. Just totally blocked it. And the inquiry's over. He says it's not going anywhere. Not going out of my committee. Bill Herring had a bill that came to the Assembly one day out of the Senate with unanimous support to give state aid to independent colleges. At this point, state aid only went to state colleges. This was to give the independents some help. And I had no problem with the bill because, you know, a lot of these Catholic schools in particular wouldn't survive without some state aid. And it went to the kids anyway. So anyway, I didn't have any problem with it. But I just filed it. I never brought it up. So eventually, you know, these calls started coming over from the Senate. What happened to my bill? Well, the chairman doesn't like it. Well, why doesn't the chairman? We don't know why the chairman doesn't like it, but it's not going to move.
You were chairman of what?
By that time, I was chairman of the Education Committee. And
in your first term?
Yeah. Yeah, I took over for Bob Valence, who was the Republicans to go. Just simply because there were so many new Republicans who came in, I happened to have an education background. And was leader of the delegation. Those two things propelled me within a year. And Bob Valence is my tutor. Bob was the head of the minority, and he would tell me, you know, this guy's from the NJEA, and you believe him on this, but don't believe him on that. Or this fellow from the school boards is good, and this one isn't.
Bob Valence had been the chairman of the Education Committee
yes.
until the Republicans
yes.
took control.
Yeah.
He stayed on the committee.
Yes, as a Democrat
minority
leader, ranking on the committee, and was my tutor, really. I mean, Bob was tremendously helpful to me, very helpful to me. And teaching me the ropes. I didn't know anything about the ropes of Trenton, but it was, I don't know where I was in the other story.
Bill Aron wanted his bill.
Yeah. So he finally came tromping down the aisle. It's very hard to get senators in those days. Anyway, he came tromping down to the Assembly, sort of beneath him, but eventually he came, and he said, "I want my bill moved." And I said, "Well, I don't think I'll go move it." And he said, "Why don't you like it?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I just don't think it's particularly helpful to my district." And he said, "What?" I said, "By the way, what's ever happened with education?" He said, "That's not a good bill." I said, "Yeah, but you know, it would be helpful to me if you were able to move that bill, and I think if you were, I might be able to see my way to move your bill." So anyway, the long story made short, both bills went together. And when I was President Drew, I was very happy I got the Herring bill through. But it was, that's how the education opportunity got through.
That's a good story.
Yeah. And the Hughes administration was totally behind it, but they couldn't do any good then because the Republicans weren't such a majority. If you didn't have the Republicans, you couldn't do it.
What did you think of Governor Hughes?
He's a wonderful man. I mean, I was so excited. He'd call me occasionally, you know, because I was sponsoring all his bills, and I was so shocked, you know. To me, a governor calling me was, I never talked to a governor in my life. I mean, it was just a, you know, and he was just a nice man. And he was very helpful to me when I became governor. Hughes. I mean, he'd sidle over, give me advice. He cared tremendously about people and institutions. I mean, when I was governor, he would call and say, "Don't forget the poor people in his institutions." And he still had a few people of his administration he was watching. You know, he'd say, "You know, this person, if you just one more appointment, they'll have tenure, or one more appointment, they'll get their pension," or so on. So he'd always do that for a former governor, as I always would. But he was helpful to me.
Who was the Speaker of the Assembly when you went there?
But by the way, he used to say, Dick Hughes used to say, you know, there's a point. You know, sometimes you have to prove a rule, and you know, Republicans are not generally good, but you're the exceptions. You prove the rule. He always used to say. Yeah, but Speaker was a guy called Al Smith. In those days, the leaders, county leaders, picked the leadership of the legislature, which was easy for us the first time because we didn't know anybody. We all got elected new from all over the state, and a lot of able people, but we didn't know anything. And Hap Farley, who was the leader of Atlantic County, put Smith in the leadership of the Assembly. Then Bergen got the next stop, a fellow called Peter Morades. And then the third went to, I think, maybe a guy called Doug Jimson from Hunterdon or somewhere.
It's not entirely different today. County chairmen still have some input into who the legislative leaders are, right?
Well, if they had, I never would have been a legislative leader.
You would have
Would not have been.
Would not have been.
No, what happened was that Al Smith was a nice man who was totally incompetent and was a very small-minded. I mean, not small-minded in a bad sense. I mean, but he'd get all excited about whether he could get money for his band to go to Washington, you know, from his hometown or something, and he wouldn't care about the Education Opportunity Fund or anything. You know, he was in little stuff for Atlantic County all the time, and I remember I stopped his band bill, and he cried in the caucus. He came and said, "I'm the leader speaker. People think I can get everything done, and you people have said." His tears started coming down. So we had to get rid of him, and at least the younger members all thought we had to get rid of him. And and one day there's a guy called Peter Carter, who was a reporter for the Newark News. And Peter Carter, who tragically died, I think, of cancer at a young age, but a very good reporter, wrote a story saying, you know, the young Turks are getting very restive, and there's a chance they will take on the county chairman and the old leadership and challenge them, and if they do, they're going to rally behind Tom Kean. I didn't know anything about it, and I don't think anybody else did either. I think he got it out of whole cloth, or he got it from somebody making up himself. I don't know where he got it, but you know, he wrote that story, and it features a feature story in the Newark News. And people started coming up to me and saying, you know, it's a great idea, will you do it? and before I know it, I had 10 or 11 legislators saying, you know, we're behind you, we're behind you. And so we had a meeting at the racetrack, I remember, down at Monmouth, Assembly Day or something, and Christy Whitman's brother, Dan Todd, and a whole bunch of people down there, and we started saying, you know, let's do it. So I ran for assistant leader, I guess, under this guy, against this guy, Doug Jimson, with the support of the Young Turks and against the county chairman, and won. And suddenly got myself into leader, again, unexpectedly.
Still in your first term? Or
Yeah,
are you now in your
first
second
term.
First term.
First term, yeah. End of first term, yeah.
So you were the number 2 Republican?
No, there was 3. There were 3 in those days. There was only 3 leaders those days. There was the speaker, the majority leader, and the assistant majority leader, and that was it. They put me into assistant majority leader.
You were the number 3 Republican?
No, it was the end of my first term, beginning of my second term. That's what I'm trying to remember. I think it was beginning, may have been the first year of the second term. But the interesting thing was, in those days, nobody in either house stayed as leader. You rotated every year, which was thought of as a reform. People across the country, legislative reform was starting to. People were talking about things. One of the things was you've got to get some consistency in leadership. People should be able to stay more than 1 year. And so the next year, as long as your party was in control, I moved up automatically to majority leader. And then I got Dick DeCourt, who was my closest friend on the Republican side, to run for assistant majority leader behind me. And then the next year, we started to lose seats. And that was the year I was elected speaker with 39 Republicans and 40 Democrats and 1 Tony Imperioli. But anyway, once you got into that rotation, I was the first speaker elected to more than 1 term in office.
1 year or 1 2-year term?
No, I was elected it was 1 year terms.
Okay, so you were the first speaker to be elected more than 1 year.
To be reelected.
To be reelected.
And at the same time, Ray Bateman did the same thing in the Senate. He became the first senator to be reelected.
Tell us the story of your famous deal with the Hudson County Democratic delegation to become speaker.
Well, it all revolves around David Friedland, who was one of the more interesting and fascinating people I've ever met in my life. He was a poet, a published poet. He was the guy who had argued the one man, one vote case before the Supreme Court and won. He had a sense of humor that was incredible. I mean, he was the one who stood up on the floor at one point and said, you know, put in a bill to turn the Statue of Liberty around because Jersey City was tired of facing its rear end. And that kind of thing.
Was he the leader of the Hudson Democrats?
No, he's the leader of all the Democrats.
Of all the Democrats?
Yeah, he was the Democratic leader. And then when, in that but he was always fractious. I mean, the Democratic Party in those days was always fractious. I mean, they didn't like each other very much, a lot of them. And when the close legislature got elected, 39 Democrats, 40 Republicans.
And Tony Imperiale.
And Tony Imperiale.
Was, what, independent?
Yeah, independent. And Tony thought he was going to be courted. And to either totally deadlock the place or to go with the Democrats to get a majority. And both parties declared nobody was talking to Tony Imperiale about anything. So it stayed at 39, 40. And for a while.
How long?
The thing wasn't functioning for a while. I can't remember the exact number of weeks, but it was a while. And meanwhile, the Democrats threw Friedland out as leader and elected, I think it was Howard Woodson. I think it was Howard Woodson. But they threw Friedland out. And Friedland had a number of alliances in the Democratic. One, he had the Hudson delegation. Then he had some alliances in Union. And then because I guess he and his father had been labor lawyers, he had these labor alliances around the state. So he started making approaches to Dick DeCourt first, who I guess knew him better than I did, and suggested, that he would be willing to vote. And first of all, he made impossible demands. No, he didn't consider it. But then, he started.
What kind of demands?
Well, he was demanding that he himself get to be co-leader, and that he was going to, and there was going to be his people all had to have committee chairmanships and this and that. I mean, just things that wouldn't make any sense.
Honest political demands, not dishonest.
Oh no, nothing dishonest, but just things you couldn't. At least I didn't think. I mean, I don't think you could run the legislature and just leave what was, I guess, 60 to 70% of the Democratic Party out in the cold. And he said, "How many votes do you need?" We said, 2. He said, "Well, I can give you up to 10 or 11. And so if any of the Republicans start going the other way, abstaining, I've got these votes I can pull out, I guess, through the labor connections around the state, and they won't vote for you unless you need them, but they're there if you need them."
Well, at some point this was aimed at the court and then transferred to you?
Yeah, the court had to bring me in on it because I was leader of the party. I was the one they were talking about as speaker. And we ended up with a deal which said basically that we were going to have the parties were going to share committees, as I remember, but not necessarily his people, just with the whole Democratic Party. In other words, Woodson's faction too, and that he was going to have some title, conference chairman, I think, something like that, which didn't do anything, but it was a title. You needed a title. And the conference committee was something supposedly Deadlocks went to, and he was going to be chair of the conference committee. I think that was and there was and people who in Hudson County wanted the same share of patronage, which was the old sergeant at arms and so on, that it had in the previous legislature. It was because they'd been told they were going to lose all that to the other group of Democrats once they lost the leadership. So none of that sounded too bad to me, because we could organize a place and get it going. So we did. But the press, for a long time, I guess, but for a while, was absolutely convinced there was things they didn't know. That it was going to come out in the end that there was this nefarious deal of some sort where Friedland was going to get this or that, what have you. And so there was a huge uproar about it at the time.
Was it embarrassing for you?
It was difficult. Embarrassing, but it was difficult because people were convinced, in my mind, people were convinced that something had gone on that hadn't gone on, and that it was a real underhanded deal. That I'd made an underhanded deal. That Friedland was walking off with state jewels or whatever. And And I think the other Democrats were mad as hell. And it took a while. But they got their fair share of committee assignments. I gave them a staff member, which I'd never had before. Friedland got no more power than had been announced. And I think it took, for the legislators, it took about 2 months maybe. For the press, it may have taken 3 or 4, until they finally figured out, you know, that there wasn't anything happening here they didn't know about. And it was a fascinating legislature because it turned into a legislature where you could not sponsor a bill unless you had a co-sponsor on the other side of the aisle. And there were friendships that developed over that in that legislature over time. And there was a lot of more bipartisan stuff, and they had the legislature in record. The legislature had a tremendous record, passed one of the probably as productive an assembly as we've ever had. Major bills got through. And a year later, they elected me unanimously, both parties.
A year later, they elected you unanimously.
Yeah, this was the first time anybody had been kept a speaker more than a year.
Friedland would later, I guess, be indicted and convicted and flee the country and fake his own death.
Yeah, he was he had this girlfriend called Holly Golightly, who he fled with, and his wife, who I later hired as governor. I guess she was, I put her in the state bureaucracy somewhere when I was governor. Well, not a major job, but something she needed. She's an able person. Friedland had left her, and she needed a job.
Do you think that that deal that you made in '71 suffers from Friedland's subsequent shenanigans in the lore of New Jersey?
Oh, probably. But, you know, the record of the legislature is there. People who served in the legislature became great friends of mine. You won't find anybody who served in that legislature saying anything different.
Was it a mistake to have made that deal?
I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't, because there was no other way to organize the legislature. Unless you went with Tony Imperiale, nobody's going to do that. Imperiale was an obvious racist, and I wasn't going to talk to him, and Democrats wouldn't talk to him.
Where had he came up through the Newark Police Department, or?
No, he had a group of citizens organization.
Oh, he was a vigilante.
Yes,
supposedly.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. But he had he had an ambulance corps, and you know, and they did some good things. I mean, if you were sick and in trouble, if you called Imperiale's service, they would get there long before the regular Newark hotline or whatever. And they would get you to the hospital, they'd worry about you afterwards, they'd help you at home, they'd help you find help for you. I mean, they were, you know, like a lot of demagogues. I mean, at heart, there were some good things he did. And people remembered that, and that's why he got elected. It wasn't just that he was a demagogue. And his ambulance corps did some, you know, people in North Ward talk very well to this day about that ambulance corps and some of the things they did for their families. And Tony was Tony's ambulance corps.
But he was a racist. Was he a pariah in the legislature?
I don't know if he's a pariah. I mean, people thought it was a little bit of a joke, but because he could be very funny, and he didn't do anything overtly racist when he was there. I remember coming from Essex County, though, that he would stir up problems after the riots. I mean, he would if he found that Leroy Jones and Amara Baccarat was someplace, Tony would show up, and each side would have people, and they'd listen. The police had to be called. And Tony, you know, fanned the flames. And
so you didn't want to make a deal with him?
No, I thought he was a racist. I really did. I mean, even though I can't say he did anything in the legislature. And a letter ran against him for governor. You know, he was one in the primary against me as governor. But so I never heard him say anything overtly racist. But I just knew what he'd done in Essex County, and I thought that was racist.
Would you make that deal again?
It would depend very much on the circumstances. If there was no other way of organizing the legislature and moving the people's business and there was no other candidate in the legislature who people thought was, they were willing to support a speaker? Yeah. And I think this, in the end, you got to do the public's business. You can't just sit there for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks with wait till a budget doesn't get passed and then you know.
So you were just 4 years into the legislature, and you were now the speaker.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there were no. See, there were no. Without the speaker, there's no committee chairman. There's no way of doing any business. You can't even organize. So you gotta do something.
Other intrigues must have been being hatched at the time. Somebody in the Democratic caucus must have been trying to get one Republican to come over that way. No?
No, not that we ever knew about. No. No, we had interesting Republicans there. I mean, we had who needed to be reassured everything was up and up. Milson Fenwick, Al Merck. I mean, we had a woman called Josephine Margetts. I mean, we had very decent, honest, very ethical people, and they had to examine that deal and make sure that they thought it was in the best interest before they supported it.
You say Dick DeCourt was a close ally of yours back then. Tell us a little more about him.
Dick DeCourt was one of the most able people I ever worked with in the legislature. Bergen County. He was sort of a hammer of the Bergen delegation. There's a guy called Dick Vanderplaat was chairman. He was a nice guy, funeral director. But Dick was really the guy. And so Dick and I would work together very closely. Again, we were the same age. Became very good friends. And generally worked together on what we were going to do in the legislature. And that was from the time I was elected almost. As soon as we figured out that Bergen and Essex together could run the place, basically, with a little help here or there. You know, we worked out how we were going to move the public forward, and what bills we were going to support, and what bills we weren't, and how we were going to deal with the governor's office, and all the rest. And he was my, when I became speaker, he was my majority leader.
You had a new governor by then, too, a Republican governor. Cahill in '69,
yeah.
Right?
Yep.
What kind of relationship did you have with him?
Pretty good. Pretty good with Bill Cahill. Yeah, he was he's a tough guy. He was had very strong ideas about what should be and what shouldn't be. I had to talk him into some stuff from time to time, and tell you a funny story if you want.
That's what we're here for.
Well, when I've always been a great environmentalist, and when Cahill was running against Bob Miner for governor, I was leading environmentalist, I guess, in the legislature. So they came to me, then New Jersey Conservation Foundation, Audubon, there wasn't much else at that point, and said, how do we get these gubernatorial candidates to pay some attention to the environment? So I said to them, you know, what other organizations do, the best is the NJEA, is they get these questionnaires out. And I said, what you got to do is you got to convince people that these questionnaires are important and that people are going to look at them. And so you've got to tell them you're going to circulate them among your members, but send out a questionnaire, tell them to fill it out, and what are the top issues? I said, well, the first thing we'd love to do, we're tired of having a Department of Conservation and Economic Development because it's all run by economic development. So we always get hit badly by the department that's supposed to be us. And so we want to get the department separated, have a Department of Conservation or Environmental Protection or whatever. That's our number one priority. And then they had a bunch of other priorities too. So I said, all right, put it all in a questionnaire. So they sent me the questionnaire, and I approved it, it was fine. And they sent it out to both campaigns. And they said, we're going to circulate it among all our members. And they heard nothing. Neither candidate answered. This is in the spring. Neither candidate answered. So we figured, oh, well, in October, early October, I get a call from the Cahill campaign. You know, Congressman wants all these questionnaires answered. We got this environmental questionnaire, and we don't know anything about that. You're the one who knows that stuff. Would you do it for us? So I said, fine. So they send me the questionnaire that I drafted. It comes back to me in the office. I'm sitting there, and yes, and everything. Then send it back to the campaign. Cahill says, Kean approves this. He signs it. And so we get back into office, and I'm the Republican leader. And I come in, I guess majority leader then, I come into Cahill's office and say, you know, I'm going to put in a bill to create a Department of Environmental Protection. And Cahill says, I don't want any more bureaucracy. I ran to get the governor. And I said, I think, Governor, that you said something about it in the campaign. And he said, I don't think so. I said, I think there's a question there. That I don't have. So I dig it out, and sure enough, he's committed to it. So, all right. So he helps me, the administration helps me get the bill done, drafted. And that's the story of how we got in the Department of Environmental Protection.
Good story.
Still got the pen.
We skipped over something as we got you to the speakership that I think we need to go back and touch on a little more. Your district included Springfield Avenue in Newark.
Yep.
You ran for office in '67 the first time. '67 was the year of the Newark riots.
Yep.
That had to be a big issue in the campaign.
No, funnily enough, not. S-400 sort of, for whatever reason, dominated the campaign. You'd think the Newark riots would be good, particularly with people killed and everything else, but it became much more of not an issue, but much after I got elected, it became much more of a, what are we going to do? And there was a commission headed by the head of Prudential and a number of other people who were making recommendations of what we could do in the city and what would happen again. But it was, I don't remember a lot of talk, funnily enough, I don't remember a lot of talk about S-400, some talk about busing, some talk about some other issues, but I don't remember a lot of, I always used to talk about education when nobody else did much. It was supposed to be something you didn't help you in politics in those days. But no, I don't. But I was very involved there. I mean, I remember going down with a group of leaders from the suburbs a week or so after the riots, because people were scared in the suburbs. People thought it was going to spread. People thought people were going to march out of Newark into the suburbs. And I remember we got down a group of whole bunch of us. We marched down to Newark from the suburbs with red buttons, "We care," you know, to just show that the suburbs were going to get involved.
Was that a bipartisan group, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure it was. A bunch of ministers and a bunch of people who cared. And I remember my wife Debbie, she didn't want me to go.
And it was dangerous?
Yeah. Well, we figured people had been killed, you know, and the city was, you know, nobody was sure how quiet the city. The National Guard had been in, and a lot of bitterness, a lot of anger, and people weren't sure. You know, she was very concerned. But it was peaceful. There was no problem whatsoever, and we met with leaders of Newark and talked about it. I've been very involved in Newark over the years.
Did you support Ken Gibson for mayor in 1970?
No, I didn't get involved in the morality.
I guess 1970.
Yeah, Ken became a friend of mine, but I supported a lot of the stuff he wanted, and I liked him very much, still do. But I didn't get involved in Newark. That was basically a primary, as I remember, in the other party, and you just don't do that. You have to get involved in primaries in the other party. But I did get involved in a lot of issues in Newark. I got involved in the takeover of, you know, the buildings at Rutgers as chairman of the Education Committee and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was just an anniversary commemoration.
I know, and they didn't ask me. I was very upset. Really, I was upset because I was very involved in that.
Hall.
Yeah, Conklin Hall. They took it over and they wouldn't let anybody in. And I came as chairman of the Education Committee, so I wanted to come in and talk to them. And they said, okay, you can come in if nobody else comes in. No policeman, nobody from Rutgers or anybody else. So I went in. And what I didn't know is that they wanted a recording kept of the meetings. They didn't trust anybody. They didn't trust anybody from Trenton or anything else. They wanted a recording kept.
These were African-American students?
Yeah, yeah. And so we talked for a while, and then the leader said, you know, we don't need a recording of you. You know, so this kid with a recorder said, you can get out. So they get out. What I didn't know is that he'd been asked by the president's office to do the taping of the recording. So he put a glass or something against the wall and tried to listen. So I've still got this very faint recording of this meeting done through the wall by this kid. But the But we talked, and what I found out was that what they were asking for was pretty sensible. And there was nothing there that, very little there that I couldn't support them on. And it turned out we got along quite well, and I put in some stuff in the Education Committee of with their requests, you know. And it was, you know, another case where, you know, the kids were fine. See, it was the elders who weren't so hot. And in those days, the educators knew nothing about a handle a situation like this. I mean, they had a wonderful liberal called Malcolm Talbot, who was head of the Newark campus. Decent as man as you ever met, very liberal, but couldn't understand the riots. And it just didn't know how to handle it at all. And just was totally incompetent. Mason Gross had no idea what to do. No idea what to do. And I stayed isolated, didn't really talk to the students. They wouldn't see them in their office if they wanted to come in, you know, the way I guess educators used to run universities and so on. But I remember thinking how sad that these good people, and they were good people, who had been liberals all their lives and yet had no idea how to handle a disturbance like that in a state's major city.
Why do you think the students trusted you enough to turn the tape recorder off?
We talked for a while. I think that's all. That's all I remember. I mean, I didn't expect them to turn it off.
You somehow won their confidence.
Yeah, we were talking, and the guy said we don't. You know, so I guess they didn't. I just they wouldn't trust the kid too much with the recorder either. But you know, got him out there. And then it was just a staff. People weren't happy about me going down there either because I was alone. I didn't go down with any staff or anything. So again, people didn't necessarily think that I was where I should be, being in the middle of a takeover in a hall all alone with these students who people thought were these terrible radicals.
And why did you go?
Because of my job. I was chairman of the Education Committee. This was the biggest, most important thing going on in education in the state right then. Plus which, I'd always been a supporter of the Newark campus. I always thought that Rutgers, for a long time, wanted to be Harvard and Aron, and they just thought Newark was something they had to have it, but it wasn't anything they were going to put any money or time or anything else into. And that used to make me mad. So I became I first met Al Felsenberg. He was a student at Rutgers, on the Rutgers campus, and I was speaking down there in Newark. But but I was, you know, I just felt that Rutgers was not paying the proper attention to Newark, and that Newark should be a real, genuine part of the university, not second-class citizens.
Did you know the mayor of Newark before Gibson, Hugh Adenizio?
Oh yeah, he's my father's friend.
Was he?
Yeah, he and Pete Rodino. The three of them represented Newark, so we used to talk all the time.
His reputation is not very good. 30, 40 years,
Yeah.
40 years later. What was he like?
Well, he's a nice guy. I think I always knew him as a nice guy. He was, I think he was a bit of a crook. But unfortunately, New Jersey's had a lot of that. But having said that, some of them go to jail, some of them don't. And he did. But I don't think he was any worse than some of the others.
How about Rodino?
Pete Rodino was a great guy. He was, but I think he did a few things early in his career in Congress. I think he had a reputation for selling. I think something to do with immigration, or his law firm. These immigrants would come and go to the law firm, and then Pete would put these bills in Congress to get the immigrant in, that kind of thing, which I don't think was great either. But Pete was a nice guy. I think wanted to do the best, and turned out to be just the right person at the right time in Watergate. I got along very well with him. Always got along very well with Pete.
State finances became increasingly important in the Hughes and Cahill administrations. What was your position on sales tax, on an income tax? prior to 1973.
I sponsored the Kale income tax.
Which never passed.
No, I don't know. It was indicted to court, I think. The two of us did. It was because we thought it was right. It was a better income tax than we got now.
How so?
More thorough. It was a very well. They came up with it on a commission, a bipartisan commission, and it was. It had about 40 bills to it, 40 different parts. It was very comprehensive, and it was graduated, but not unreasonably so. And it was. It took care of the state's problems. And would have grown with time, but it just its support disintegrated. We were within about 3 votes at one point of passing it, but it started to lose support. And McHale called us in and said, "Look, this is obviously very hurtful politically to people who are supporting it at this point. So it's not. It looks like it's not going to pass. So any of you who want to get off it in the final vote, it's fine with me."
So you took a vote on it?
We took a vote on it, and about half the supporters took a walk, which was understandable, and I stayed with it, and some of the others did too, but it was too bad. It was a good proposal. It would have saved the state a lot of trouble if we'd passed that.
Well, was it better than the burn income tax of 5 years later?
Much better. You know, there's some good. Now, the burn income tax, Brendan had a whole bunch of proposals for that income tax because it took so long to do, and there were different variations of it, and some of them better than others. I thought the last one was dreadful because it was tied. I voted against it, even though I supported one along the way. I supported another income tax proposal along the way, but he was. It was tied to the T&E bill, thorough and efficient bill, and I thought that was a terrible bill. And I thought it was going to hurt the schools. And I voted against that and voted against the income tax that was attached to it.
How did you think it was going to hurt the schools? I mean, it was raising money for the schools.
It was to just give money with no strings attached to urban districts that were, in my mind, practicing educational child abuse. And all it was doing is giving them more money. No strings attached, no reform attached, no conditions attached, no accountability attached, nothing.
The sales tax.
I think that's what I said on the floor.
The sales tax came in under Hughes, I
yes.
believe?
Yeah.
Were you in the legislature at that?
No.
No, you didn't have to vote on that?
No.
In hindsight, was it a sensible tax at the time?
Well, you had to have some taxes. I mean, you couldn't run the state without taxes, and for a while we did, and that's why we had this lousy state college system and so many things that the state didn't do that other states were doing. We were way behind in a lot of areas, and we needed the taxes. But I think we wasted most of that income tax money. I still do. I mean, I think they passed that thorough and efficient bill, tied it to the income tax. And then they had a series of court decisions that said, even so, you're not giving enough money. So it became millions and billions that went over a number of years into the so-called, we call now the Abbott districts. And if you take the test scores when the bill was passed, and the test scores by the 90s, they were lower. In other words, we gave all this money, and the test scores went down and not up. The kids were being treated worse, not better. And so it was a waste of money. And the court caught on in about 2000, I think, the last court decision, so that it started to tying it to things like early childhood education, and say, you've got to do these things. And then that made some sense, but it was a long time coming. And I think that turned out to be in my mind, wasn't. I think the court decision would have been, if the legislature had acted differently, I think the court decision, we could live with the court decision. But the combination of the court decision and the simple adding money with no restrictions hurt the state very, very badly, and still does. I mean, we still get a lot of money that's gone out there without any sign of how it improved one single child's education.
I have a feeling we're going to come back to that theme as we progress through your career.
I, by the way, gave Brendan the votes to to pass the income tax.
You gave him the votes?
Yeah.
But
because I let the caucus go. I had a party position, you know, 'cause income tax is an important issue. I said, no, I'd been talking to Brendan, and you know, we had a few members who would have voted for the income tax had they been free, and so I said, you're free. You know, I voted for one of them after that, and we ended up with, I guess, 2 or 3 votes coming out of the Republicans, and it passed by 1 vote. So if the Republicans, as a Republican leader, if I'd held the caucus to a party line vote, we never would have had an income tax. Because the Democrats voting against it would just, you know, you're not going to get any of them. They were just dead against it.
Let's go back to Cahill for a second. What was he like as governor?
Well, he was opinionated. I think he was totally the right motivation. I mean, I think he really wanted to do the right thing for the state. His appointments, I think, were questionable in some cases. They came out of areas politically that I wouldn't have made appointments out of.
Does that mean certain machines? Or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he didn't have the most able cabinet. He had some very able people. He had a wonderful attorney general called George Kugler, who was terrific, and some other good. He let Paul Schuon, who was Secretary of State, do all the political work, which probably turned out to be a mistake. He had some family problems along the way, which got him very emotionally involved in certain legislation, particularly in the drug area. But by and large, he was a good governor. He was a good governor. I didn't always get along with him. I mean, he had a temper. People used to say, you know, if he comes into the office, one of the friends in the council always told me, if he comes into the office and you look at his eyeball, if the red is above 50%, don't go see him. But it's funny, he had a sense of humor. I remember going in trying to get some money for the New Jersey Opera from him once, and he said, not unless they come here and sing an Irish song. So we got him to come there and sing an Irish song, and he gave us some money. And there was some good legislation. I mean, there were some good laws that went through under Cahill. I sponsored one of them.
Cahill's, I'm sorry.
Like some good laws went through under Cahill. I mean, he supported my. I did the whole Wetlands Act, which is a tough bill to get through, but had Cahill's support.
Do you recall any strong disagreement you had with Cahill? Any fight you had with Cahill?
Just when I wouldn't do everything he wanted me to. You know, he was very, you know, I'm governor and this is what we're going to do, and occasionally to say, no, I'm not. You know, and actually, I'll tell you where he was right and I was wrong, I think. When he was doing, because one of his great accomplishments was a sports complex in the whole Meadowlands district. And I was one of the sponsors of the whole Meadowlands area and all that. And the sports complex came along. I supported that and sponsored that. But then when the Rockefellers and people in New York started really trying to hurt the financing, so it was questionable whether we get the financing to do it. They wanted a moral pledge from the state. And we'd said very clearly that moral pledge wasn't for the sports complex. You know, we had to raise money legitimately for that, and it wasn't. State shouldn't obligate itself, so I voted against the obligation.
And in hindsight?
I think I was wrong. I was wrong, because that could have blocked the sports complex if I'd been a speaker. I didn't hold anybody else to my point of view, but I said, I can't. And then I got threatened. I got threatened by one of the state's newspapers for doing that.
In your day, the rotation of legislative leaders was such that it wasn't automatically a stepping stone to becoming to higher office. I mean,
no, nobody ever got higher office out of the assembly except me. I think I'm the only person elected out of assembly in the state's history.
What were you thinking about that back then?
Oh, never. No.
No?
No, never. I ran for governor first because I'd been in the assembly 10 years. I did every leadership position there was. I looked, because of Watergate, I thought it was going to be a long time before the Republicans became the majority again. I was sick and tired of being in the minority, because it's fun for about 2 years, and then it's no fun, particularly if you've been in the majority. And so I wanted to make some points about education, about the environment, and things I'd been a hobby horse for a number of years, but you don't get listened to very much when you're in a minority. So I thought, how do you get heard? Well, if you run for governor, they've got to pay attention to what you have to say. Whether you win, I didn't think I was going to win, and I didn't. And I was running, you know, and I thought about it very hard, because Ray Bateman was and is a very close friend of mine. And Ray and I probably had almost no disagreements, and worked very closely together when he was Senate President and I was Assembly Speaker. And so I remember going to see Ray to tell him I was going to do it. And I thought, if Ray said, don't do it, I probably was going to say, yeah, but will you deal with these issues and so on. Instead Ray said, well, good luck then. You know, fine. Went out and ran. But it was to make, I didn't think I was going to be elected governor, because Ray Bateman had but one other county chairman, something like that. I mean, it was pretty much a fait accompli. But I did want to make some points. I didn't want to go out with a whimper. I wanted to go out with a bang after 10 years in the legislature.
I think you ran for Congress before you ran for governor, and we want to.
Yes. We
want to get there.
Yeah.
But before we get there, let's stay with the period where you're Speaker of the Assembly, and
yeah.
Cahill's the governor. We've mentioned Meadowlands, DEP, wetlands.
Yeah, they helped engineer that Friedland thing too. Before I even got there, they managed to stay a mile away from it afterwards. But Dick worked with Paul Sherwin on that whole thing before I even heard about it.
With the governor's office and
yeah.
They,
oh yeah. They didn't want the Democrats to be in control, I don't think, of the legislature, I guess.
What were the other critical issues of the state back then?
Well, I was very involved in the environmental issues. And we hadn't been paying much attention to the environment at that point. And this was, so I guess we put through about 10 to 12 important environmental bills, and I sponsored all of them. Cahill signed all of them. It got harder. Everyone got harder, because the people who were on the other side, the momentum of Earth Day and everything, we got a lot of stuff through. But then the builders and the lawyers and all of that, who really didn't wanted to build and didn't really want more stuff preserved, or wanted to pollute, and more pollution, not less pollution, for whatever reason, got better and better organized. So it became harder and harder and harder. Each one, the last one I think being the wetlands bill, which was blocked in the Senate at one point. We couldn't get it going. And a fellow called Al Beetleson sponsoring it for me in the Senate. And they had it blocked until we started getting a lot of activists going. We had the League of Women Voters and some others organized a thing where the opposing legislators all got sent clamshells. When the clamshells started piling up on the desks, we knocked a couple of votes loose and got it through.
What support staff did the legislature have back then?
When I started, none, really. I mean, we had the majority party had a person, minority party had nobody. We hired, not me, but we hired Joe Gonzalez, who was the first legislative guy.
Executive director.
Yeah, executive director. Then later on I hired Carl Golden, and a woman called Joni Wisnowski, I think her name was, as a research assistant. And then when I became Speaker, I gave the Democrats somebody who thought that was fair. I remember his name. He was a good guy, Joe somebody. But so they then had...
you had 2, 3 people? That was it?
Yeah. You had legislative services. And Sam Alito, the father, with a guy called Art Applebaum and one other assistant, drafted all the bills. And if you wanted a bill, you went to them, they got drafted. And then you had a guy called Lanning, who also was involved, but it was a professional staff who took care of both parties. And the parties themselves had nothing until Joe Gannon, that was the guy we hired for the Democrats hired for themselves.
Obviously, both parties now have significantly larger staffs,
Yeah.
Partisan staffs. Is that a good thing, do you think?
Everything's exaggerated. I mean, no, it's good. Well, yes, it's good to have a partisan staff. It's not good to have the huge bureaucracies they have now in the legislature. I mean, this is I don't know how much the legislative budget is now, but it doesn't have to be that. Well, I think the minority and the majority parties both probably have a few more than they need right now, or should have, given the economic climate, certainly. But we got along. We got along with the people we had. No, I sponsored the bill to create the Office of Fiscal Affairs, and with Danny Todd, who was Christie's brother, was in the legislature then. And I remember that was because the frustrating thing in the legislature in those days was that you had no fiscal expertise. So if you went into the governor and said you needed something, the governor would say, we have the money for it, or we don't have the money for it. And
the Office of Fiscal Affairs was within OLS?
It didn't exist.
But you created it within OLS?
Yes, yeah. And it was a separate. We carried it as a separate body, I think, originally. But and I remember we were part of a national. Legislators around the country were starting to feel as if the legislature had to have some fiscal expertise of its own. Because I remember we'd walk into Cahill's office, and he'd have the guy who was running the fiscal side of the budget, Walter Wexler, sitting there. And I would say, we want to put this bill in to do this. And Wexler would say, well, I'm sorry, I just don't think there's money for it. And I would say, Governor, we really need to do this. And Wexler would look at Cahill and say, do you really want to do this, Governor? And Cahill would say, okay, yeah. And Wexler would say, well, I think we can find the money. But it was that kind of an arrangement. And so there was, the legislature was really handicapped. So I remember we put in this Office of Fiscal Affairs, and it took a while to get the idea going and get it through. And it got to Cahill's desk. And Cahill called me in and said, you know, if I sign this, every governor from here on in is going to curse the day I put my signature to it. And I had some days as governor when I cursed the day he put his signature to it. Because it was a nice time when the governor had total fiscal control of the state and could tell people whether there was money or not. That was a good time for the governor. But that was one of the most important reforms, just about legislative staff and so on. That, giving the legislature a fiscal arm was one of the most important things we did.
You were Speaker from 71 until when?
73.
73. You stayed in the legislature after 73?
Yeah, became minority leader.
Your party was hurt in the 73 election. Byrne became governor, and your party you were decimated.
I came back as one of 14 Republicans.
Because of Watergate.
Yeah, I remember walking down to my hometown, Livingston. But I'd always had incredible support, you know, and a guy called me across the street, one of the town lawyers, and he said, you know, you're the best legislator we've ever had in this district. I want you to know that, and I also want to know I'm going to vote against you. I said, what? And he said, we got to send Nixon a message. You know? And it was bad. It was bad. And the fact that legislature before, where I treated the Democrats fairly as Speaker, really came back to benefit.
How so?
Because they were very decent to me as minority leader. They let me do things, let me get things through. They treated me with total courtesy. Howard Woodson, Bill Hamilton, that whole gang, Bernstein, they all gave me every Couldn't have been nicer. It couldn't have been nicer or more helpful. When I needed something, they gave it to me. And it was because we were friends, because we become friends in the previous legislature, when I treated them fairly.
I guess there's a lesson there.
I think there is. Somebody ought to learn it, too.
Had you met President Nixon prior to Watergate?
Yes. Yeah, my father served in Congress with him. So I'd met him when he came through the state campaigning. I can't say I really knew him. But and then I was an alternate delegate to the convention in Miami.
In '68.
Yeah. I remember that. I was pledged to Cliff Case as a favorite son. And Nelson Gross, the chairman of Bergen, broke the delegation, New Jersey delegation, to give Nixon votes. And he came back to the hotel, we hanged him in effigy.
Nixon or Nelson Gross?
Nelson Gross, yeah.
Explain that. Was Nixon being challenged in '68?
Yeah, Nelson Rockefeller.
Nelson Rockefeller.
Yeah, was very much there. And Ronald Reagan was starting to emerge out of the West.
And the entire delegation went pledged to native son Clifford Case?
Yeah.
And then Nelson Gross at one point wanted to
Curry.
Release the delegation to go with the winner.
He wanted to curry favor with the winner, yeah. And we wanted to hold on for at least one ballot and see what happened, because Reagan was coming on, and we didn't know what was going to happen.
And you wanted Rockefeller.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most of your Republican colleagues at that convention wanted Rockefeller? Or?
We did in Essex. And I think Webb Todd did, the state chairman. I think he was a Rockefeller friend, so I think he did.
Did you, I mean, Watergate was a year and a half long, incredibly unfolding saga, but did you sense early on that with every newspaper headline, your party here in New Jersey was going to pay a price?
Yeah, I never thought the price we'd paid, because I didn't think people would, I didn't understand yet that people take such, that's a party as a whole, and you can be a town councilman. If the president of your party, or the leader of your party, does something stupid in Washington or something bad, that they take it out on you. And that's the way it works. And I learned that. I learned that lesson. I mean, I after that comment I had from the guy in Livingston, I worked very hard that election, harder than I had for a number of years, because I got scared, and I came closer to losing that year than I did any other year.
Do you recall who ran against you from the Democratic side?
Yeah, I think it was. I think that was I get these years confused, but I think it was what's his name? It was a labor leader, Giblin, Tom Giblin, I think. Yeah, very nice guy.
The same Tom Giblin who's still there in the assembly today?
Is he still there?
Yeah, Giblin's in assembly.
Is it the same? Is he an older guy now? Is that the same Giblin? Maybe it's a son or something.
Probably 60, maybe the one who's there now.
Well, he would have been older than that, I think. Yeah, I think he would have been older than that, I think.
How about Cahill's, the scandals in Cahill's administration? Did they also play a role in that landslide, do you think? No. No, Cahill scandals played a role for Cahill. And Cahill lost the primary to Charlie Sandman. And it was a whole combination of things. But certainly the fact is top people were getting indicted. And the old News was on a crusade against Cahill at that point for whatever reason. So every time there was any kind of indictment or anything else, huge banner headlines. And that was in my backyard, so I knew we were in problems. We're going to stop for today. When we resume, we'll start with you as minority leader in 74 and 75, and your decision to challenge Millicent Fenwick for Congress. Is that what happened?
No, she was...
to run against her.
She decided to run against me.
Oh, she did?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have an opportunity to set the record straight next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tony said when he was taped.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
it was terrific.
Yeah.
Tired?
That was Brendan's fault, by the way.
Was it?
Yes.
Well, we'll hear that story, I hope.
Okay. All right.